The iron bells of Ravenstone Castle rang through the frozen valley 3 hours before dawn, and every soul who heard them understood what it meant. Duke Ravenstone had returned from war, not in triumph, in silence. The kind of silence that made grown men check the locks on their doors and mothers pull their children closer to the fire. Because when Ciedric came home quiet, someone was about to die. The castle loomed over the northern cliffs like a predator carved from black stone, its towers jutting into the winter sky like broken teeth. No banners flew, no torches burned in welcome, just the bells, cold and relentless, announcing the return of a man the kingdom feared more than it respected. This is the story of how power devours everything it touches, how cruelty becomes currency, and how one woman walked into hell wearing silver silk and survived long enough to set it on fire. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will shatter every assumption you have about monsters and the women who refuse to bow to them. The throne room of Ravenstone Castle was a cathedral of violence disguised as architecture. Banners from conquered provinces hung like corpses from the vaulted ceiling. The floor was polished black marble, smooth as ice, cold enough to leach warmth through boot leather. Weapons lined the walls, not decorative pieces, but working instruments of war, each one stained with history no court historian would ever write down. Duke Ravenstone stood at the base of his throne, still wearing his travel cloak, dust from the northern roads coating his shoulders like ash. He did not sit. He never sat when delivering judgment. At 34, he carried himself with the stillness of a man who understood that movement was a language, and stillness was the most terrifying dialect of all. 73 soldiers lined the chamber walls, hands on sword hilts, eyes forward. Not ceremonial guards, killers. Men who had followed Ciedric through 6 years of border wars and understood exactly what their duke was capable of when crossed. A woman stood in the center of the room. Lady Seraphina Vale wore mourning silver despite having buried no one. Her father's estate had collapsed beneath gambling debts so catastrophic the family name itself had become a joke, whispered in southern parlors. The royal court had offered exactly one solution to preserve what remained of the Vale legacy: marriage to the Duke of Ravenstone. Salvation wrapped in chains. Seraphina stood perfectly still, hands folded at her waist, spine straight as a blade. 23 years old. Dark hair pulled back severe enough to make her cheekbones look carved, eyes the color of smoke before fire. She did not look afraid. That was the first problem. Ciedric studied her the way he studied enemy fortifications before ordering them burned to rubble. He moved down the 3 steps from his throne with deliberate precision, boots echoing across marble. Every person in the chamber held their breath. He stopped 6 feet away, close enough to smell the lavender soap she had used that morning, close enough to see the pulse beating at her throat. "You understand why you are here," he said. Not a question, a statement that assumed compliance. Seraphina lifted her chin, not defiance, refusal to collapse. "To save my family from ruin." "No." Ciedric's voice dropped to something quiet and infinitely more dangerous. "You are here because weak bloodlines survive only when stronger ones decide they should. Your father gambled away 3 generations of wealth. The crown stripped his titles. Your brothers fled to mercenary companies rather than face the shame. You are the last piece on a board that has already been cleared." The entire chamber went silent. Even the torches seemed to burn quieter. Seraphina met his eyes without flinching. "Then I am here because you decided I should be." Something shifted in the air. Ciedric felt it immediately. That microscopic change in atmospheric pressure that happened before storms broke. This woman was supposed to bow, supposed to weep, supposed to thank him for the mercy of accepting damaged goods into his bloodline. Instead, she stood there looking at him like he was a problem she intended to solve. "You will live in the West Tower," Ciedric said, turning away before anyone could see the flicker of interest that crossed his face. "You will attend court functions as required. You will speak when spoken to and remain silent otherwise. My steward will provide appropriate clothing. The wedding is scheduled for 6 weeks from today. Do you have questions?" "Yes." Ciedric stopped mid-stride. Behind him, 3 guards shifted weight, hands tightening on weapons. No one interrupted the Duke, ever. He turned slowly. Seraphina had not moved, but something in her posture had changed. She looked less like prey and more like someone taking inventory of the trap before deciding how to dismantle it. What happens? She said carefully. If I refuse, the chamber temperature dropped 10 degrees. Kaedric walked back toward her, each step measured, until he stood close enough that she would have to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. He leaned down, voice dropping to a whisper only she could hear. Then your father dies in debtor's prison within a month. Your mother loses the cottage the crown allowed her to keep out of pity. Your youngest brother, the one studying theology in the southern monasteries, gets conscripted into a penal legion and sent to die clearing rebellion camps in the eastern wastes. And you, Lady Vale, spend the rest of your considerably shortened life understanding exactly what happens to noble women who mistake my generosity for negotiation. He straightened, watching her process the weight of what he had just described, waiting for the collapse, the tears, the inevitable surrender. Seraphina's jaw tightened. Her hands trembled once, then went still. 6 weeks, she said quietly. Understood. Kaedric gestured toward the door. 2 guards moved to escort her out. She walked between them with her head up, silver dress whispering across marble, disappearing into the shadowed corridors beyond. The moment the door closed, Lord Aldrich Thorne, Kaedric's master of coin and oldest surviving advisor, stepped forward from the shadows near the throne. That woman is going to be a problem, Aldrich said. Kaedric returned to his throne, finally sitting, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Yes, he agreed. She is. Then why accept the arrangement? There are a dozen noble houses desperate to marry daughters into Ravenstone. Families with wealth, political alliances, military strength. The Vale bloodline brings you nothing but complications. Kaedric was silent for a long moment, staring at the door through which Seraphina had vanished. The crown suggested this match specifically, he said finally. The king wants me tied to a ruined house. No powerful alliances. No rival families gaining influence through marriage. Just a broken name attached to mine as a reminder that even I must occasionally bow to royal authority. And you agreed. I agreed because the king is surrounded by vipers who believe Ravenstone grows too powerful. Better to give them this small victory than force a confrontation I am not yet ready to win. Kaedric stood, unfastening his travel cloak. Besides, a wife from a ruined house cannot afford to betray me. She has no family wealth to run to, no powerful relatives to shelter her. She will be entirely dependent on my protection. Aldrich looked unconvinced. Dependent women are predictable, he said. That one looked at you like she was measuring you for a noose. Kaedric smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Good, he said. I have no use for women who collapse at the first application of pressure. If she survives the next 6 weeks without breaking, she might actually be useful. He walked toward his private chambers, leaving Aldrich alone in the throne room, surrounded by weapons and shadows and the lingering scent of lavender soap. The West Tower was a gilded prison. Seraphina stood at the window of her new chambers, looking down at the courtyard 70 feet below. Soldiers drilled in formation, their movements sharp and synchronized, preparing for wars that never seemed to end. Beyond the castle walls, the northern territories stretched toward a horizon choked with winter clouds. The room itself was luxurious in the way a tomb might be luxurious. Velvet curtains, the color of dried blood. A 4-poster bed large enough to drown in. Bookshelves filled with volumes chosen by someone who had never read them. A fireplace big enough to roast a pig. And bars on the windows. Decorative ironwork, ornate and expensive, but bars nonetheless. The door opened without warning. Seraphina turned to find a woman in her 50s entering, carrying an armload of fabric samples. Gray hair pulled into a severe bun, eyes sharp as broken glass. Lady Vale, the woman said without warmth, I am Magistra Corvin, head of the household staff. The Duke has instructed me to prepare your wardrobe for court appearances. Seraphina watched the older woman spread fabric samples across the bed. Black, charcoal, midnight blue. Every shade carefully chosen to ensure she disappeared into the background of whatever room she entered. No color, Seraphina observed. The Duke prefers his household to maintain dignity and restraint. Vibrant colors attract unnecessary attention. I see. And what does the Duke prefer regarding his future wife's opinions? Magistra Corvin's hands paused over the fabric. The Duke prefers obedience, silence, and the basic intelligence to understand which battles are worth fighting. She looked up, and for just a moment, something almost like sympathy flickered across her face. You are not the first woman to enter this castle believing defiance is strength, Lady Vale. You will not be the first to learn otherwise. How many came before me? One. None as a bride, but the Duke has had mistresses, political arrangements, women who believed they could manage him. Magistrate Corvin began gathering the fabric samples. Magistrate Corvin began. They all learned the same lesson eventually. Duke Ravenstone does not compromise. He does not negotiate. He does not change. You either adapt to his expectations or you shatter against them. After the magistrate left, Serafina stood alone in the center of her gilded cage, surrounded by silence and the distant sound of swords clashing in the courtyard below. She had 6 weeks to figure out how to survive a man who had spent his entire life perfecting the art of breaking people without ever raising his voice. The first dinner was a test. Serafina understood that the moment she entered the great hall and saw the seating arrangement, a table long enough to seat 40 guests, but only 3 places set, Cedric at the head, Lord Aldrich Thorne to his right, and a single chair at the far opposite end, isolated, visible to everyone but close to no one. A statement in furniture. You are here, but you do not belong. Serafina walked the length of that table in absolute silence, aware of every pair of eyes tracking her movement. Servants lined the walls like statues. Guards stood at attention near the doorways. The entire production calibrated to make her feel small. She sat without waiting for permission, folded her hands in her lap, and met Cedric's gaze across 40 feet of polished oak. He smiled. Not warmth. Acknowledgement of the game beginning. Lady Vale, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the hall. I trust your chambers are acceptable. They're functional, she replied. Functional. How practical. Cedric lifted his wine glass. Lord Thorne and I were just discussing the upcoming trade negotiations with the southern provinces. Fascinating matters of tariffs and shipping routes. I'm certain you would find it devastatingly boring. The dismissal was so smooth it almost sounded polite. Serafina picked up her own wine glass. On the contrary, I find economic leverage far more interesting than most dinner conversation, particularly the ways powerful men use trade restrictions to starve provinces into compliance. The hall went absolutely silent. Lord Thorne's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. 3 servants near the door exchanged horrified glances. Even the guards seemed to tense, waiting for the explosion. Cedric set down his wine glass with exaggerated care. You have opinions about governance. I have observations about cruelty disguised as strategy. Fascinating. Tell me, Lady Vale, how many provinces have you governed? How many trade routes have you negotiated? How many rebellions have you crushed before they could destabilize an entire region? None, Serafina admitted. But I have watched my own family destroyed by the same economic mechanisms you describe as necessary governance. So perhaps I understand the human cost better than men who only see numbers on ledgers. Cedric stood slowly. The sound of his chair scraping across stone echoed like a gunshot. He walked the length of the table toward her, each step deliberate, until he stood directly beside her chair. He leaned down, one hand resting on the table, caging her in. You think I do not understand cost? His voice was quiet, lethal. I have buried more soldiers than you have met in your entire sheltered existence. I have signed execution orders that kept entire provinces from descending into civil war. I have made decisions that haunt me in ways your comfortable ignorance cannot begin to comprehend. Do not mistake my willingness to do what is necessary for a failure to understand consequences. Serafina turned her head to look up at him, refusing to lean back, refusing to show fear. Then why do the villages around Ravenstone starve while your soldiers feast? Why do tenant farmers lose children to winter sickness, while court officials drink wine that costs more than a year's harvest? If you understand cost so well, Your Grace, why do you allow the people who depend on you to pay it? For 3 seconds, no one in the hall breathed. Then Cedric laughed. Not a polite chuckle. A genuine laugh, dark and surprised. The sound of a man encountering something unexpected in a world that had long ago stopped surprising him. He straightened, looking down at her with an expression she could not quite read. You are either the bravest woman I have ever met, he said softly, or the most suicidal. I have not decided which. He returned to his seat, and the dinner continued in tense silence. But as Serafina forced herself to eat food that tasted like ash, she noticed something that terrified her more than Cedric's threats. He kept looking at her, not with anger, not with dismissal, with interest. The nightmare started on the third night. Serafina woke gasping, tangled in silk sheets, her heart slamming against her ribs. The same dream, always the same. Her father's face as the magistrates dragged him toward debtor's prison. Her mother's hands shaking as she signed away the last piece of property their family owned. Her brother's letter from the monastery, carefully worded to hide his terror at the prospect of conscription. All of it her fault for one moment of defiance in a throne room she should have approached with humility. She threw off the covers and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Outside, snow had begun to fall, coating the castle grounds in white silence. A knock at the door made her spin around. "Enter," she said, wrapping a robe around herself. Magistra Corvin stepped inside carrying a tea tray. "I heard you moving," the older woman said. "Night terrors are common in this castle. The walls remember too much violence to allow easy sleep." She set the tray on a small table near the fireplace and began preparing tea with practiced efficiency. Serafina sat across from her, drawing her knees up, suddenly feeling far younger than 23. "Does he ever sleep?" Serafina asked quietly. Magistra Corvin did not need to ask who she meant. Rarely, and never well. "I have served this household for 30 years, Lady Vale. I watched Cedric's father rule these lands with an iron fist that made his son's methods look merciful by comparison. And I watched what that kind of upbringing does to a child." "You are making excuses for him." "What?" "No, I am providing context. The old Duke believed weakness was a disease that had to be burned out. When Cedric was 8, his father executed the castle steward in front of the entire household for the crime of showing Cedric kindness after his mother died. The message was clear. Affection is weakness. Mercy is failure. Power is the only currency that matters." Serafina wrapped her hands around the warm teacup. "That does not justify cruelty." "It does not, but it explains it. Cedric learned survival through violence because violence was the only language his father spoke. And now he rules the northern territories using the same methods because they work. Fear keeps provinces in line. Brutality prevents rebellion. And the crown profits from his ruthlessness while pretending moral superiority. You defend him. I understand him. There is a difference." Magistra Corvin stood to leave, then paused at the door. "A word of advice, Lady Vale. Cedric respects strength, not defiance for its own sake, but genuine resilience. If you want to survive here, you must learn the difference between challenging him and simply refusing to break. One earns his attention, the other earns his contempt." After she left, Serafina sat alone drinking tea and watching snow fall beyond her barred windows, wondering if there was any real difference between survival and slow suffocation. The breaking point came during the council meeting. Serafina had no business being there. Women did not attend political discussions in Ravenstone Castle, but she had spent 2 weeks watching, listening, piecing together the patterns of power that flowed through these halls like poison in veins. And she had questions no one else seemed willing to ask. She entered the council chamber wearing black velvet that Magistra Corvin had grudgingly approved, her hair pulled back severe enough to make her look older, harder, less like someone who could be dismissed. The room fell silent. Cedric sat at the head of a table surrounded by 7 of his most powerful advisors, military commanders, trade magistrates, lords who controlled key territories, men who had spent decades consolidating power and had no intention of surrendering it to a woman who existed solely as political ornamentation. "Lady Vale," Cedric said, his tone carefully neutral, "this is a closed meeting. But I am aware. I am also about to become your wife, which means decisions made at this table will affect my future as much as yours. I would like to observe." Lord Aldrich Thorne leaned forward. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular. We are discussing military deployments and intelligence regarding the increasing number of villages reporting starvation," Serafina interrupted. regarding the fact that your northern border patrols are stretched so thin that smuggling operations have tripled in the past 6 months, and regarding the rather interesting discrepancy between reported tax revenue and actual funds entering the castle treasury. Every man at the table went absolutely still. Every man at the... Kaedric's expression did not change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "And where," he said quietly, "did you acquire this information?" "I talk to people, servants, stable hands, soldiers who believe a noble woman asking questions is simply making polite conversation. It is remarkable what people will say when they assume you are too decorative to be dangerous." She walked to the table and placed a folded piece of parchment in front of Kaedric. "3 of your magistrates are siphoning tax revenue through false shipping records. The evidence is on your desk if you care to review it. Additionally, your patrols are failing because you have allocated resources to intimidating political rivals instead of securing actual borders. And the villages are starving because your trade policies prioritize enriching southern nobles at the expense of northern farmers." The council chamber erupted. "This is outrageous. Council, Your Grace, you cannot allow this kind of insubordination." "She has no authority to make accusations against sitting council members." Kaedric raised one hand. Silence fell like a blade. He unfolded the parchment Seraphina had given him. "Read it slowly." His jaw tightened incrementally with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Lord Thorn. "Aldrich, explain to me why Lady Vale has uncovered embezzlement that my own master of coin somehow failed to notice." Aldrich's face went white. "Your Grace, I can assure you—" "No, you cannot, because the evidence is here: dates, amounts, forged signatures." Kaedric stood, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. "You will have 3 of my magistrates arrested and interrogated by sunset. If they are innocent, I will personally apologize. If they are guilty, I will execute them myself for stealing from provinces already bleeding." He turned to Seraphina. "You, stay. But you hurt these spots." The other council members fled the chamber like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Within seconds, only Kaedric and Seraphina remained, standing on opposite sides of a table covered in maps and deployment orders. "Do you have any comprehension," Kaedric said, his voice dangerously soft, "of what you just did? I exposed corruption." "You humiliated my advisors in front of their peers. You demonstrated that a woman with no formal authority has better intelligence networks than men I have trusted for years. You made them look incompetent. They are incompetent." Kaedric moved around the table with predatory speed, closing the distance between them until Seraphina's back hit the wall and she had nowhere left to retreat. "You do not understand how power works in this world," he said, one hand braced against the wall beside her head. "Those men control armies, resources, political alliances that keep this entire region from descending into civil war. And you just made them look like fools. Then perhaps they should stop being fools." His other hand slammed against the wall on her opposite side, caging her completely. "This is not a game, Seraphina. These are men who have killed for less than public embarrassment. Men who will now see you as a threat that needs to be eliminated. Do you understand? You just painted a target on yourself because you could not resist proving how clever you are." She met his eyes without flinching, even though her heart was trying to break through her ribcage. "Then protect me. You are the Duke of Ravenstone. You claim absolute authority over these territories. If your advisors cannot tolerate being corrected by a woman, that says more about their fragility than my intelligence." Something shifted in Kaedric's expression. Not anger. Something far more complicated. "You infuriating, reckless, absolutely maddening woman," he said quietly. "You are going to get yourself killed. Not if you do your job properly." For one breathless moment they stood there, close enough that Seraphina could see gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body against the cold stone wall. Then Kaedric pushed away from her and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the snow-covered courtyard below. "The wedding is in 4 weeks," he said. "Until then, you will have a personal guard detail, 2 soldiers, armed. They will accompany you everywhere, including meals, walks, even your chambers at night." That seems excessive. That is survival. You just made enemies of powerful men who believe women should be seen, not heard, and certainly not obeyed. If you refuse protection, you will die. It is that simple. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was something Serafina had never seen before. Not anger, not threat, something almost like concern wrapped in fury. "I do not know what I am supposed to do with you," he said quietly. "You are meant to be decorative, compliant, a political arrangement that stays in the background and produces heirs on schedule. But instead you walk into council meetings exposing corruption and making demands like you have any right to be heard. You are either going to change everything about this castle, or you are going to die trying. And I genuinely do not know which outcome terrifies me more." Serafina straightened her shoulders, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from her dress. "Perhaps the question you should be asking," she said, "is why you built a kingdom where intelligence and compassion are considered more dangerous than brutality." She walked past him toward the door, then paused. 4 weeks until the wedding," she said. "That gives us both time to decide whether survival is worth the cost of becoming something neither of us recognizes." She left him standing alone in the council chamber, surrounded by maps of territories he controlled, and the growing realization that controlling land was infinitely easier than controlling the woman who had just walked out of his life for the third time that week without permission. That night, 3 magistrates were arrested. By dawn, all 3 had confessed to embezzlement. By noon, Caedric executed them personally in the castle courtyard, and the entire household watched as the Duke of Ravenstone demonstrated exactly what happened to men who stole from provinces already dying. But as Serafina watched from her tower window, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Caedric looked up at her window before delivering the final blow, and he smiled. Not cruelty, not triumph. Something far worse, recognition. Because somewhere between their first confrontation and this moment of calculated violence, Duke Caedric Ravenstone had started seeing her as something other than a political arrangement. He had started seeing her as an equal. An equality, Serafina was beginning to understand, was the most dangerous thing that could exist between a man who ruled through fear and a woman who refused to be afraid. The executions changed something fundamental in the castle's ecosystem. Not the violence itself. Ravenstone had seen plenty of blood spilled in its courtyards over the centuries, but the reason behind it. Caedric had not killed those magistrates for stealing from him. He had killed them because Serafina had exposed them, because she had walked into his council chamber and proven herself more competent than men who had served him for decades. And everyone in the castle understood what that meant. The Duke of Ravenstone had just validated a woman's authority over his own advisors. The implications spread through the household like poison through veins. Serafina felt the shift immediately. Servants who had previously ignored her now stepped aside when she walked through corridors. Guards who had smirked at her questions now answered with military precision. Even Lord Aldrich Thorne, who had dismissed her as decorative nonsense 3 weeks ago, now watched her with the careful wariness of a man reassessing threat levels. But validation came with a price tag Serafina had not anticipated. She was no longer invisible, and invisibility, she was learning, had been her only real protection. The first assassination attempt happened on a Tuesday. Serafina was crossing the eastern courtyard toward the stables, flanked by her 2 assigned guards, when an arrow buried itself in the wooden post 6 inches from her head. The guards reacted instantly, shields up, swords drawn, forming a barrier between her and the direction of fire. Silence crashed across the courtyard. Soldiers froze mid-drill. Stable hands ducked behind water troughs. Everyone waiting for the second arrow that would confirm intent. It never came. Instead, a figure dropped from the ramparts above and sprinted toward the outer walls. One of Serafina's guards gave chase while the other physically lifted her and carried her back toward the main castle, ignoring her protests that she could walk perfectly well on her own. They found Caedric in the armory inspecting sword quality with the quartermaster. The moment he saw Serafina's face, he knew. He dismissed the quartermaster with a gesture and waited until the door closed before speaking. "Tell me." The guard recounted the attack in clipped military terms. Trajectory, distance, escape route. Serafina stood silently throughout, still feeling the phantom wind of that arrow passing close enough to move strands of her hair. When the guard finished, Caedric turned to Serafina. "Did you see the archer?" "No, it happened too fast." "Did you recognize anyone behaving suspiciously before the attack?" "Half the people in this castle behave suspiciously. I have no baseline for normal." Caedric almost smiled. Almost. Then his expression went cold in a way that made the temperature drop. "Triple her guard detail," he told the soldier. 6 men minimum. Rotating shifts. No one approaches Lady Vale without clearance from me personally. And find the archer. I want him alive." After the guard left, Kedrick walked to a weapons rack and selected a dagger, testing its balance with practiced ease. "You understand what just happened?" he said, not looking at her. "Someone tried to kill me." "Yes, I gathered that from the arrow." "Someone tried to send me a message. The arrow was the delivery method. You were the envelope." He turned to face her, still holding the dagger. "The magistrates you exposed had powerful friends. Men who believe I overstepped by executing sitting council members based on a woman's accusations. They cannot attack me directly without triggering civil war, but they can attack you. And by attacking you, they force me to choose between protecting my future wife and maintaining political stability." Serafina felt something cold settle in her stomach. "So I am leveraged now. A weak point they can exploit to control you." "Yes, which means you have 2 options. You can retreat, stop asking questions, stop attending meetings, become the decorative ornament you were supposed to be from the beginning. Let them believe you learned your lesson." He walked toward her, still holding that dagger, and placed it carefully in her hands. "Or you can learn to defend yourself, properly, because I cannot protect you from enemies who operate in shadows, and I refuse to lock you in a tower for the rest of your life." Serafina looked down at the weapon. It was heavier than she expected. The blade gleamed in torchlight, sharp enough to catch skin just from improper handling. "You're giving me a weapon. I am giving you a choice. Survival through submission or survival through strength. Both are valid strategies, but only one will earn you any measure of freedom in this world." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell leather and steel and something darker beneath. The scent of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for violence. "If you choose the dagger," he said quietly, "I will train you myself, every morning before dawn. No guards, no witnesses. Just you learning how to kill someone before they kill you. But understand this, Serafina. Once you make that choice, there is no going back to innocence. You cannot unlearn how to hurt people. You cannot unknow where to place a blade to cause maximum damage. That knowledge changes you permanently." Serafina met his eyes, searching for manipulation, for the trap she knew had to be hidden somewhere in this offer. "Why would you do this? Teaching me to fight makes me more dangerous to you." Kedrick smiled, and it was the saddest expression she had ever seen on his face. "Because I am beginning to suspect that the only woman who could survive being married to me is one capable of killing me if necessary, and I would rather arm you myself than watch you die because I kept you weak." He left her standing in the armory holding a dagger and the weight of a decision that would define everything that came after. She chose the dagger. The training began the next morning at dawn, in a courtyard so deep within the castle that even screams would not carry beyond its walls. Kedrick was already there when Serafina arrived, dressed in simple training leathers, his hair tied back, looking less like a duke and more like the soldier he had been before titles and territory had claimed him. "Show me how you would defend yourself if I attacked you right now," he said without preamble. Serafina barely had time to process the question before he moved. Not at full speed, she understood that instinctively, but fast enough that her body reacted on pure panic. She stumbled backward, raising her hands defensively, and Kedrick stopped 6 inches from her face. "You are dead," he said flatly. "Your instinct is to retreat. Retreat creates distance, and distance gives your attacker time to adjust strategy. In close quarters combat, retreat equals death." He stepped back and gestured for her to return to starting position. "Again. This time, when I move toward you, move toward me. Close the distance. Get inside my reach where my size becomes a disadvantage instead of a weapon. They drilled the movement 50 times. 50 times Serafina forced her body to ignore every survival instinct that screamed at her to run. 50 times she stepped into Kedrick's space instead of away from it, learning the geometry of violence, understanding how proximity could be a shield instead of a vulnerability. By the time the sun cleared the eastern walls, Seraphina's legs were shaking, and her shirt was soaked through with sweat. "Enough," Kadric said. "You will be useless tomorrow if I push you past functional exhaustion today. We train in increments. Consistency matters more than intensity." He handed her a water skin, and she drank gratefully, too tired to maintain any pretense of dignity. "You were a soldier," she said between gulps, "before you became Duke. I was many things before I became Duke. Soldier, mercenary, occasionally an assassin when the crown needed someone eliminated quietly. My father believed titles meant nothing without the ability to defend them personally. So he sent me to fight in every border conflict, every territorial dispute, every ugly little war that kept the kingdom functioning. I learned young that power without violence is just expensive theater." He sat on a stone bench, stretching muscles that moved like coiled steel beneath skin. "My father once told me that love was a luxury weak men indulged in before stronger men killed them for it. He said the only emotion worth cultivating was fear, because fear could be controlled, measured, deployed strategically. Love made you vulnerable. Fear made you invincible." Seraphina sat beside him, maintaining careful distance. "Do you believe that?" Kadric was silent for a long time, staring at the courtyard walls. "I believed it for 20 years. And then you walked into my throne room looking at me like I was a problem you intended to solve, and now I do not know what I believe anymore, which terrifies me more than any assassin ever could." He stood abruptly, as if regretting the admission. "Same time tomorrow. Bring the dagger I gave you. We start weapon work next week, Bran." He walked away before Seraphina could respond, leaving her alone in a courtyard that smelled like sweat and old violence and the possibility of something neither of them had names for yet. The court dinners became psychological warfare disguised as social functions. Seraphina attended them now, with 6 guards forming a perimeter around her chair, an unsubtle reminder that the Duke of Ravenstone considered her important enough to protect with small army deployments. The other nobles hated it, hated her, hated the implication that a woman from a ruined house somehow warranted more security than lords who controlled actual territory. Lady Cordelia Ashford was the worst of them. She arrived at the 5th dinner wearing crimson silk, cut low enough to be strategic, and enough jewelry to fund a small military campaign, 32 years old, widow of a general who had died suspiciously young. Beautiful in the way that sharp objects are beautiful, all edges and calculated danger. She positioned herself directly across from Seraphina at the table and smiled like a knife being unsheathed. "Lady Vale," she said, her voice carrying across the hall. "How lovely to see you still among the living. I heard about the unfortunate incident with the arrow. So distressing when common criminals target noble women." Seraphina recognized the play immediately. Reduce the assassination attempt to random violence instead of political conspiracy. Make it seem like Seraphina was being dramatic about nothing. "How kind of you to be concerned, Lady Ashford, though I suspect whoever loosed that arrow was far from common. The trajectory suggested someone with military training." Cordelia's smile sharpened. "Oh, my dear, surely you are not suggesting a soldier would target you. What possible reason could trained military personnel have for wanting you dead?" I am. The entire table went quiet. Nobles stopped eating. Servants froze in place. Everyone waiting to see how Seraphina would respond to such an obvious trap. Because the real question beneath Cordelia's words was clear. What makes you important enough to assassinate? Seraphina set down her wineglass with deliberate care. "I suspect, Lady Ashford, that some people find competence in women more threatening than incompetence in men. Perhaps the archer simply could not tolerate watching me survive in a world designed to break me." Kadric, seated at the head of the table, made a sound that might have been a laugh or a cough. Impossible to tell which. Cordelia leaned forward, all pretense of civility evaporating. "Competence. How charming. Tell me, dear, what exactly have you accomplished beyond convincing His Grace to execute 3 magistrates? Some of us have actually contributed to this kingdom's stability, rather than simply disrupting it. Stability built on theft and corruption is not stability, Lady Ashford. It is a house built on sand waiting for the tide to come in. And yet you know nothing about governance, nothing about the compromises necessary to maintain peace. You are a child playing at politics because the Duke finds your naivety temporarily amusing. Serafina stood slowly. Her guards tensed, hands moving toward weapons. "You are correct," she said quietly. "I know nothing about governance. But I know everything about what happens to families when powerful people prioritize profit over human lives. I watched my father destroyed by men who believed noble titles absolved them of basic decency. I watched my mother lose everything because people like you decided her family's suffering was an acceptable cost for your continued comfort. So yes, Lady Ashford, I am disruptive. And I will continue being disruptive until the people running this kingdom remember that power is supposed to serve people, not devour them." She walked out of the hall before anyone could respond, 6 guards scrambling to follow, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the entire castle was holding its breath. Caedric remained seated, watching the doorway through which Serafina had vanished. Then he turned to Lady Ashford with an expression that made her go pale. "That woman," he said conversationally, "is going to be my wife in 3 weeks, which means insulting her intelligence is equivalent to insulting mine. I trust that will not happen again." It was not a question. Cordelia lowered her eyes, fury and fear warring across her face. "Of course, Your Grace. My apologies." But Caedric saw the truth in her expression, saw the hatred, saw the calculation already forming behind her eyes. And he understood that Serafina had just made an enemy far more dangerous than any random archer. 2 days later, Serafina received her first death threat. It arrived on expensive parchment, sealed with wax that bore no identifying mark. The message was short and brutally direct. Broken houses should stay broken. 3 weeks is a long time. Accidents happen. She brought it to Caedric immediately. He read it once, twice, then burned it in the fireplace of his study while Serafina stood watching flames consume elegant handwriting. "This is Cordelia's work," he said, "or someone operating on her behalf. The parchment quality. The phrasing. This is a noblewoman's threat, not a soldier's. What are you going to do?" Caedric turned to face her, and something in his expression had shifted. Not anger, something colder, more permanent. "I'm going to move the wedding up. From 3 weeks to 3 days. "But shh," Serafina felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "You cannot be serious." "I am completely serious. Right now you are a future duchess. A political arrangement that can be disrupted, delayed, eliminated. But once we are married, you become permanent. Attacking you becomes attacking Ravenstone directly. The consequences escalate exponentially." He walked to his desk and began pulling documents from drawers, his movements sharp and decisive. "I will send messengers to the capital tonight. The ceremony will be small, private. Just enough witnesses to make it legally binding. No grand celebration, no week-long festivities. We marry, I sign the contracts making you officially Duchess of Ravenstone, and anyone plotting against you suddenly has to recalculate their entire strategy." Serafina tried to process what he was saying, but her brain kept snagging on the timeline. 3 days. 72 hours before her entire life changed permanently. "You are doing this to protect me. I am doing this to remove you as a variable my enemies can exploit. There is a difference. Is there? Because it sounds remarkably like you are rearranging your entire political strategy to keep me alive." Caedric looked up from the documents, and for one unguarded moment, Serafina saw past the Duke, past the warrior, past every layer of armor he had built around himself. "Yes," he said quietly, "I am. Because the alternative is watching you die, because I was too proud to admit that keeping you safe matters more than maintaining appearances. And I've already lost too many things to pride." He returned to the paperwork, shutting down the moment of vulnerability as quickly as it had appeared. "The wedding is in 3 days. Magister Corvin will handle the preparations. You will remain in your chambers under guard until the ceremony. No exceptions, no arguments." Serafina should have been angry, should have protested the way he was simply deciding her fate without consultation. But instead she felt something else entirely. Relief. Because being Duchess of Ravenstone meant protection, power. The authority to fight back against people who believed destroying her was an acceptable political strategy. And maybe, somewhere beneath all the calculation and survival instinct, it meant something else too. It meant Caedric had chosen her not because he had to, but because losing her had become unacceptable. 3 days, she said. 3 days, he confirmed. Neither of them said the rest. That 3 days was nowhere near enough time to prepare for binding yourself to someone capable of executing people without hesitation. That 3 days was an eternity when every hour carried the possibility of assassination. That 3 days was both a deadline and a lifeline, and they were both gambling everything on the hope that marriage would provide more protection than it cost in freedom. The morning of the wedding, Serafina woke to find a wooden box on her dresser. Inside was a necklace. Black pearls strung on platinum chain, simple and devastating. No note, no explanation. Just the necklace and the implications that came with it. Kaedric had left her a gift. Not flowers, not perfume, not any of the traditional tokens men gave women before weddings. He had given her something beautiful and hard and impossible to break, something that would last long after softer things had disintegrated. Magistra Corvin helped her dress in silence. No wedding gown, Serafina had refused, choosing instead a dress of midnight blue velvet that made her look like a storm-given human form. Practical, powerful. Nothing like the white innocence traditional brides wore to symbolize purity. "You are making a statement," Magistra Corvin observed, fastening the necklace around Serafina's throat. "I am marrying a man who executes people before breakfast. Purity seems somewhat irrelevant. He is not as cruel as he pretends to be." Serafina met the older woman's eyes in the mirror. "Yes, he is. He is exactly as cruel as he pretends to be. But he is also capable of other things, things that terrify him more than any enemy ever could, and that is what makes him dangerous." The ceremony took place in the castle chapel at noon. 20 witnesses, no music, no flowers, just stone walls and winter light filtering through narrow windows, and the weight of vows that felt less like promises and more like battle formations being established. Kaedric stood at the altar wearing black, always black, looking like death itself had taken human form and decided to get married. When Serafina walked down the aisle, his expression did not change, but his eyes tracked her movement with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The priest rushed through the ritual. No one wanted this ceremony to last longer than absolutely necessary. Every second was another opportunity for disruption, for violence, for someone to object in ways that involved crossbows rather than words. Then came the vows. Traditional words. Ancient promises. Obedience, honor, till death. Serafina spoke them clearly, watching Kaedric's face for any sign of triumph. But he just looked tired, like a man who had fought too many battles and knew more were coming. When it was his turn, he said the words with mechanical precision. Then he added something the traditional vows did not include. "And I swear on my father's grave that anyone who harms you will die screaming. This is not a threat. It is a promise witnessed before God and these assembled lords. You are mine now, and I protect what is mine with absolute brutality." The chapel went absolutely silent, because Kaedric had just transformed wedding vows into a declaration of war against anyone foolish enough to target the new Duchess of Ravenstone. The priest cleared his throat nervously. "You may kiss the bride." Uranus. Kaedric stepped forward, one hand moving to cup Serafina's face with unexpected gentleness. He leaned down, his breath warm against her mouth. "No going back now," he whispered. "I know." Then he kissed her, and it was nothing like Serafina expected. Not brutal, not possessive, just thorough, deliberate, a claiming that felt less like conquest and more like recognition. When he pulled back, his thumb brushed across her cheekbone once before he stepped away and turned to face the witnesses. "It is done," he announced. "Lady Serafina Vale is now Duchess Serafina Ravenstone. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me personally." No one spoke, because they all understood what had just happened. Kaedric had not just married a woman. He had armed her with his name, his title, his authority. He had taken someone the nobility considered insignificant and elevated her to a position where she could destroy them with legal impunity. And everyone in that chapel knew that Serafina was exactly the kind of woman who would use that power. The wedding feast was a tense affair. Nobles attended because refusing the Duke's invitation was political suicide, but the resentment was thick enough to taste. They smiled and offered congratulations while plotting ways to undermine the new Duchess before she could consolidate power. Serafina sat beside Kaedric at the head table, wearing her black pearl necklace and the title of Duchess like armor. She watched the room with new eyes. These were no longer her betters. These were her peers, and some of them were her enemies. Lady Cordelia Ashford approached midway through the feast, wineglass in hand, smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Congratulations, Your Grace," she said, emphasizing the title just enough to make it sound like mockery. "Such a whirlwind courtship. I am certain you will find married life fulfilling." Serafina smiled back. "I am certain I will find it educational. After all, I have so much to learn about governing the Northern Territories. Perhaps you could share your insights on managing estates efficiently without embezzling tax revenue. I understand that is a rare skill." Cordelia's smile froze. "I'm sure I do not know what you mean." "Of course you do not, just as I am sure the discrepancies in your late husband's financial records are completely innocent. Widowhood is so complicated. All those numbers to manage without a man's guidance." The threat was delicate as lace and sharp as broken glass. Serafina was letting Cordelia know she had been investigated. That evidence existed. That one wrong move would result in consequences. Cordelia's knuckles went white around her wineglass. "You should be careful, Your Grace. This castle has a long history of teaching arrogant women humility. And you should remember, Lady Ashford, that I am no longer a powerless noblewoman you can threaten with impunity. I am the Duchess of Ravenstone, which means when you threaten me, you threaten my husband. And we both know how the Duke handles threats." Caedric's hand settled on Serafina's shoulder, a casual gesture that carried the weight of absolute possession. "Is there a problem?" he asked Cordelia, his voice mild and utterly terrifying. "No, Your Grace. Just offering congratulations." "How kind. You can go now." It was not a suggestion. Cordelia retreated, and Serafina felt Caedric's thumb trace small circles against her collarbone, through the fabric of her dress. "You are enjoying this?" he said quietly. "I am discovering that power is intoxicating." "Yes, it is. Be careful. Addiction to power destroys people faster than any poison." Serafina turned to look at him. "Is that what happened to you?" Caedric's expression went distant. "I was destroyed long before I found power. The addiction just gave me purpose while I walked through the ruins." Before Serafina could respond, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Guards surrounded someone, swords drawn. Shouts echoed across the hall. Nobles scrambled backward, clearing space for whatever violence was about to unfold. Caedric was on his feet instantly, moving toward the disturbance with predatory speed. Serafina followed despite the guards trying to hold her back. At the center of the chaos stood a man in travel-stained clothes, blood seeping through bandages wrapped around his torso. He looked half dead, swaying on his feet, barely conscious, but he had eyes only for Caedric. "Your Grace," the man gasped. "Message from the eastern border. The king is dead, murdered in his sleep 3 nights ago. The capital is in chaos. Civil war has started, and the Crown Council has declared you a traitor for executing royal magistrates without permission." The hall went absolutely silent. Serafina felt ice flood her veins. Because in one sentence everything had changed. The king was dead. War had come. And Caedric had just been branded an enemy of the state, which meant Serafina had married a traitor approximately 4 hours ago. Caedric's expression did not change. He looked at the messenger, then at the assembled nobles watching with mixed horror and calculation. "Secure the castle," he ordered. "No one leaves, no messages go out. We are now officially under siege preparation protocols." He turned to Serafina, and she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Not fear, acceptance. The look of a man who had been waiting for this moment his entire life and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. "Welcome to marriage, Duchess Ravenstone," he said quietly. "I hope you are ready for war, because we just ran out of time for anything else." The war room filled within minutes of the messenger's collapse. Maps unfurled across oak tables like prophecies written in ink and parchment. Candlelight threw shadows against stone walls, while outside the castle bells rang their warning into a sky already dark with approaching storm. Caedric stood at the center of it all, still wearing his wedding clothes, blood from the messenger staining his sleeve where he had caught the dying man before he hit the floor. Dead. The king was dead. Murdered while Caedric had been busy transforming a political arrangement into something that now felt catastrophically like a mistake. Lord Aldrich Thorne entered first, followed by the military commanders who controlled Ravenstone's actual fighting capacity. General Marcus Veld, scarred and brutal, a man who had survived 30 years of border wars by being meaner than anything the enemy could field. Commander Olivia Cross, cavalry specialist, the only woman in the Northern Territories who commanded troops through competence rather than birthright. And Captain Greaves, master of the castle guard, who looked at Seraphina with the kind of assessment usually reserved for evaluating structural weaknesses in fortifications. Seraphina stood beside Caedric because she had nowhere else to stand. 4 hours ago, she had been Lady Vale, insignificant and survivable. Now she was Duchess Ravenstone, which meant she was either the most protected woman in the kingdom or the most valuable hostage, depending on which army arrived first. Caedric spread his hands across the largest map, studying terrain features like a man reading scripture. "Talk to me about numbers," he said. "How many loyal troops can we mobilize within 48 hours? General Veld stepped forward. His voice graveled from too many years shouting orders across battlefields. 15,000 in the immediate territories. Another 8,000 within a week if we call in the border garrisons. But pulling those troops leaves the eastern frontier completely exposed to raiders. The eastern frontier is not our problem anymore. If the Crown Council has declared me traitor, then I am no longer defending kingdom borders. I am defending Ravenstone." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that would consume everything. Commander Cross traced supply routes with one scarred finger. "We can hold the castle indefinitely. Food stores are sufficient for 6 months under siege. Water is sourced from underground springs they cannot poison. Ammunition reserves are adequate for sustained defense. The question is not whether we can survive. The question is what we do after surviving." "We survive first," Caedric said. "Strategy comes after we are certain there will be a tomorrow to strategize in." Lord Aldrich cleared his throat, and the sound carried implications that made everyone in the room tense. "Your Grace, we need to discuss the political dimensions. The Crown Council did not declare you traitor randomly. Someone provided evidence. Someone close enough to court proceedings to know about the magistrate executions and frame them as unlawful killings." Bokin. Seraphina watched Caedric's jaw tighten incrementally. The only visible sign that Aldrich had just named the poison they were all thinking about, but no one wanted to say aloud. Betrayal from inside. "Who in this castle has regular contact with the capital?" Caedric asked quietly. The silence that followed was answer enough. Because the truth was, everyone had contact. Every noble, every merchant, every servant with family in southern provinces. Ravenstone was not isolated. It was connected to the kingdom through 1,000 invisible threads, and any one of those threads could strangle them. Captain Greaves spoke carefully. "Your Grace, with respect, we should consider the possibility that the information came from someone who attended your wedding, someone who would have known the exact timeline of events." Every person in the room suddenly became aware of Seraphina's presence. She felt the shift like temperature dropping, the way eyes flickered toward her and then away. The calculations happening behind carefully neutral expressions. Because she was the newcomer. The unknown variable. The woman from a ruined house who had somehow convinced the Duke of Ravenstone to marry her on an accelerated timeline. Convenient timing, those glances said. Suspiciously convenient. Caedric's hand settled on the small of her back. A gesture of possession and protection that could not be misinterpreted. "My wife is not under suspicion," he said, and his voice carried the kind of finality usually reserved for death sentences. "Anyone who suggests otherwise can explain their reasoning to me personally, in private, with sharp objects available." The room relaxed fractionally, but Seraphina understood what had just happened. Caedric had defended her, had made it clear that questioning her loyalty was equivalent to questioning his judgment, but he had also marked her as protected, which meant everyone would now watch her twice as carefully to see if that protection was deserved. Trust was currency, and Seraphina had just been loaned more than she had earned. The first attack came 36 hours later. Not the Crown's army, something worse. A coordinated assault from 3 noble houses who had decided that eliminating Caedric before royal forces arrived would win them favor with whoever eventually took the throne. Lord Pemberton from the western valleys, Duke Harrow from the southern trade routes, and Lady Cordelia Ashford, who commanded her late husband's military resources with the kind of vicious competence that made experienced generals nervous. Serafina watched from the battlements as armies assembled in the valley below. Thousands of soldiers carrying banners that had sworn loyalty to Ravenstone 6 months ago, now preparing to burn it to foundation stones. The betrayal was not even subtle. It was calculated, public. A statement that Cadric's power had limits, and those limits had just been reached. Cadric stood beside her, still as carved stone, watching his world prepare to devour him. Cordelia will hit the eastern gates first, he said conversationally. She is smart enough to know that is our weakest defensive position. Pemberton will attack from the north to split our forces. Harrow will hold back and wait to see which assault succeeds before committing his troops. You sound almost impressed. I am impressed. This is good strategy. If I were attacking Ravenstone, I would do exactly the same thing. He turned to look at her, and Serafina saw something in his expression that made her chest constrict. Acceptance. The look of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for this exact moment and was almost relieved the waiting was finally over. I need you to do something for me, he said quietly. And you are going to hate it. Serafina felt ice settle in her stomach. What? Oh, I need you to leave, tonight, before the siege locks us in. I have a route prepared through the underground passages. 6 guards. Enough supplies to reach the coast. A ship waiting to take you across the northern sea to territories where my name still carries weight. The world tilted sideways. You are sending me away. I am keeping you alive. There is a difference. No, there is not. You are deciding my survival matters more than my presence here, which is exactly the kind of decision that gets made for children and prisoners, not for duchesses who are supposed to share your authority. Cadric's hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. You have been a duchess for 36 hours, Serafina. That is not long enough to die for a title you barely understand. If Ravenstone falls, and it probably will, they will execute everyone inside these walls. Nobles, soldiers, servants, anyone who showed me loyalty. But you can still escape. You can survive this. And surviving is the only thing that matters. Serafina pulled away from his touch, fury and fear warring in her chest. You do not get to marry me and then ship me off like cargo when the situation becomes inconvenient. I chose this. I chose you. And that means I stay. You chose survival. I am giving you survival. Do not be stupid enough to mistake loyalty for strategy. The words hit like a slap. Serafina stepped back, feeling the stone wall solid against her spine. You bastard! You absolute calculating bastard! You married me to protect me, and now you are abandoning me because protection is too expensive. I am abandoning you because keeping you alive matters more than keeping you close. And if you cannot understand that difference, then you are too naive to survive what is coming. They stood there at the cold wind, staring at each other across a distance measured in inches and miles simultaneously. Below them, armies prepared for violence. Around them, the castle hummed with desperate preparation. And between them, something fractured that neither of them had names for yet. I am not leaving, Serafina said finally. You do not have a choice. Yes, I do. Because you gave me a dagger and taught me how to use it. Because you made me your equal in front of witnesses. Because you told me survival meant strength, not submission. So do not stand here now and tell me that survival actually means running away while you die, defending walls that represent everything you hate about your father's legacy. Cadric flinched, barely, just a microscopic contraction around his eyes. But Serafina saw it and knew she had drawn blood. My father's legacy, he said quietly, is the only reason these walls still stand. Is the only reason the northern territories have not descended into the same chaos currently consuming the capital. I hate what he made me, but I will not apologize for using those tools to keep people alive. Then let me help you. Use me the same way you use fear and violence and political brutality. I am a resource, Cadric. Stop treating me like a liability. Before he could respond, Captain Greaves appeared on the battlements, moving fast, his expression carrying the kind of urgency that preceded catastrophic news. Your Grace, we have a problem. The Eastern Gate guards just discovered sabotage. Someone poisoned the gate mechanism. It will not close properly. We are working on repairs, but if Cordelia attacks before we fix it, we are looking at a breach within hours. Kadrick's expression went absolutely flat. The emotional conversation with Serafina disappeared beneath layers of tactical assessment. How many people had access to that mechanism? Castle staff, select guards, and anyone with a reasonable knowledge of fortress architecture who could have bribed their way past sentries. So everyone, fantastic. Kedrick turned to Serafina. This conversation is not over. Stay inside the castle, stay away from windows, and for the love of everything, stay alive. He left before she could argue, disappearing into the organized chaos of a fortress preparing for siege, leaving Serafina alone on the battlements with a captain who looked at her with the kind of assessment that made her spine straighten. He is trying to protect you, Greaves said. I know. That is the problem. Most women would consider that romantic. Most women have not been trained to kill by the man trying to ship them off to safety. I am not most women, Captain, and I am not leaving this castle while it is under attack. Greaves studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. Good, because we are going to need every capable body we have. And you, Duchess Ravenstone, are about to discover exactly what it costs to survive in a world designed to kill you.
Will she,
The betrayal came from inside. It always did. Serafina was in her chambers 3 hours before the first assault when she heard voices in the corridor outside. Low. Urgent. The kind of conversation that happened in shadows when people believed they were alone. She moved to the door silently, pressing her ear against heavy wood. Has to happen tonight, before Cordelia breaches the eastern gate. Once the fighting starts, we will not get another chance. The voice was familiar. Serafina's mind raced through mental catalogs of everyone she had met in the past 6 weeks. Lord Aldrich Thorne, Kadrick's oldest advisor, the man who had served Ravenstone for 3 decades. And you are certain the payment will be honored? Another voice, younger, less certain. The Crown Council guaranteed it. 50,000 gold. Titles in the southern provinces, complete immunity for anything done in service of eliminating the Duke. They want him dead more than they want territory. This is not strategy. This is punishment. Serafina's blood turned to ice. What about the Duchess? What about her? She is collateral damage. Unfortunate, but necessary. Besides, a ruined house produces ruined daughters. No one will mourn her. The voices faded as the speakers moved down the corridor. Serafina stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Aldrich Thorne was the traitor. The man Kadrick trusted more than anyone. The advisor who had been present for every strategic decision, every defensive preparation, every conversation about loyalty and survival. And he had sold them all for gold and titles in a kingdom that would not exist by the time this war finished consuming itself. Serafina's hand shook as she strapped on the dagger Kadrick had given her. The weight felt different now. Heavier. More real. Because she was about to walk into a war room full of men who might kill her the moment she accused one of their own of treason. But staying silent meant Kadrick would die, not knowing the poison had come from inside his own inner circle. And that felt like a betrayal worse than anything Aldrich could orchestrate. She found Kadrick in the armory, inspecting weapon distributions with General Veld. He looked exhausted, more than exhausted. He looked like a man who had been holding the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders and had finally realized the weight was designed to crush him. I need to speak with you, Serafina said. Privately. Right now. Kadrick looked up, saw her expression, and dismissed Veld with a gesture. What happened? Serafina closed the armory door and leaned against it, buying herself 3 seconds to figure out how to say the thing that would destroy whatever fragile trust held this castle together. Aldrich is the traitor. He is working with the Crown Council. They paid him to sabotage defenses and ensure you die during the assault. I heard him talking to someone in the corridor outside my chambers 20 minutes ago. The silence that followed was absolute. Kadrick did not move, did not speak, did not even seem to breathe. He just stood there holding a sword he had been inspecting, his knuckles white around the grip. You are certain, he said finally. I'm certain I heard Lord Aldrich Thorne discussing payment for your assassination. I'm certain he mentioned 50,000 gold and immunity. I am certain he called me collateral damage. Beyond that, no. I am not certain of anything. Kedrick set down the sword with exaggerated care. Then he walked to the wall and braced both hands against stone, his head bowed, shoulders rigid with tension. 30 years, he said quietly. Aldrich has served Ravenstone for 30 years. He taught me strategy when my father's lessons only included brutality. He kept this castle functioning during the 3 years I spent fighting border wars. He is the closest thing to family I have left. I know. That is why I am telling you instead of killing him myself. Kedrick turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was something Serafina had never seen before. Not anger, not betrayal. Something worse. The look of a man realizing that every foundation he had built his life on was constructed from materials designed to collapse. If you are wrong, he said, you will have destroyed my relationship with the only person I trust. If you are right, you will have proven that trust itself is a weapon used against people stupid enough to wield it. Either way, I lose something I cannot afford to lose. Then we verify. We set a trap. We feed Aldrich false information and see if it reaches Cordelia before the attack. If it does, we know. If it does not, I will apologize publicly, and you can throw me off the battlements yourself. Kedrick closed his eyes, and for just a moment he looked young, vulnerable, like the boy who had watched his father execute people for showing kindness and learned that survival meant cutting sentiment out of yourself like infected flesh. What information? He asked. Serafina had been thinking about this since she heard Aldrich's voice in the corridor, had been running scenarios and possibilities and outcomes through her mind like a strategist instead of a frightened woman making accusations. Tell him we are planning a counter-assault, a sortie through the northern passages to hit Pemberton's supply lines before Cordelia attacks. Give him specific timing, specific troops. Make it detailed enough to be believable. Then we watch. If Pemberton reinforces those supply lines or Cordelia adjusts her assault timing, we know the information leaked. And if Aldrich is innocent, we waste resources preparing a fake assault while real enemies breach our gates. Yes, but if he is guilty and we do nothing, we die not knowing the knife came from someone we trusted. At least this way we die informed. Kedrick laughed, and it was the saddest sound Serafina had ever heard. You have been a duchess for less than 2 days, and you already think like someone who has survived multiple assassination attempts. I do not know whether to be impressed or horrified. Be both. I am. He walked to her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into his face like scars from battles no one else could see. If this goes wrong, he said quietly, if I am about to execute the only person who has shown me consistent loyalty for 3 decades, I need you to promise me something. What? That you will leave. Tonight. Through the passages. Without argument. Because if I lose Aldrich and this castle falls, I need to know that something I protected actually survived. I need to know that all of this meant something beyond just defending walls my father built from the bones of people he destroyed. Serafina reached up and placed her hand against his face. Feeling the tension in his jaw, the barely controlled fury and fear and grief warring beneath his skin. I promise, she lied. If this goes wrong, I will leave. Because she understood now what Kedrick had been trying to tell her on the battlements. Survival was not about physical presence. It was about making sure something of yourself continued beyond the moment when violence finally caught up with you. And if staying meant they both died, then leaving became the only way to ensure Kedrick's protection had actual meaning. Even if that meaning felt like abandonment wearing survival as a mask. I'd say. The trap was set before midnight. Kedrick called Aldrich to the war room and outlined the fake sortie plan with enough detail to make it credible. Troop numbers, timing, routes through the passages, everything an enemy would need to counter the assault effectively. Serafina watched from the shadows near the doorway, invisible in the darkness, tracking Aldrich's reactions, looking for tells, micro-expressions, anything that would confirm or deny the accusation burning in her chest. But Aldrich was good, professional. He asked appropriate questions, offered tactical suggestions. behaved exactly like a loyal advisor, helping his duke plan a desperate gamble. When the meeting ended, Aldrich left through the main corridor. Serafina followed at a distance, moving through shadows like a predator tracking prey. She had learned this from Cadric during their training sessions: how to move silently, how to use darkness as camouflage, how to become invisible in plain sight. Aldrich walked directly to his private chambers, and for 3 terrible minutes Serafina thought she had been wrong, that she had accused an innocent man and destroyed Cadric's last remaining source of trust. Then Aldrich opened a hidden panel in his wall, pulled out parchment and ink, and began writing a message with the kind of speed that came from practice. Serafina watched through the partially open door as Aldrich detailed everything Cadric had just told him: troop movements, timing, routes, every piece of intelligence that would allow Pemberton to slaughter Ravenstone forces the moment they emerged from the passages. Her hand moved to the dagger at her waist, muscle memory from weeks of training. Her body knew what to do before her mind finished processing the betrayal. She could kill him right now. Walk into that room and put a blade through Aldrich's throat before he finished writing. Eliminate the traitor and solve the problem with violence the way Cadric had taught her. But something stopped her. Not mercy, not hesitation, something colder, more calculated, because killing Aldrich now would confirm the betrayal, but destroy any possibility of using it strategically. The information he was writing could be used, twisted, turned into a weapon against the people who thought they had purchased loyalty with gold. Serafina backed away from the door silently and ran through the corridors toward the war room where Cadric waited. She found him standing at the table, staring at maps he probably had memorized decades ago. "Well?" he said without turning around. "He's writing it down right now. Every detail. He has a hidden compartment in his wall where he keeps his treason organized." Cadric's shoulders dropped infinitesimally, the last hope bleeding out through a wound no one else could see. 30 years? He said again. I trusted him for 30 years. I know. He was at my father's funeral. He helped me navigate court politics when I was barely 20. He taught me that strategy could replace brutality if applied intelligently. I know. Cadric turned to face her, and Serafina saw tears tracking down his face. Not sobbing, not collapsed grief, just silent acknowledgement that something inside him had broken beyond repair. I do not know how to do this without him, Cadric said quietly. I have relied on Aldrich's judgment for so long that I do not trust my own anymore. He was the voice that tempered my worst impulses, the person who told me when brutality was necessary and when it was just cruelty wearing strategy as an excuse. Without him, I am just my father, and I swore I would never become my father. Serafina crossed the room and took his hands, gripping hard enough to hurt. You are not your father. Your father would have executed Aldrich the moment suspicion arose. You gave him the benefit of doubt. You set a trap to verify before taking action. That is not your father. That is you choosing to be different even when it costs you. It costs too much. Yes, it does. But the cost of becoming your father would be higher. You know that. It is why you are crying instead of killing. Cadric pulled her close, burying his face against her shoulder, his body shaking with suppressed grief. Serafina held him, this man who ruled through fear and brutality, who had executed people without hesitation, who had built his entire identity on being stronger and meaner and more ruthless than anything the world could deploy against him, and discovered that even apex predators could be brought down by the people they trusted most. What do we do? He asked finally, his voice muffled against her shoulder. Serafina thought about the message Aldrich was writing, about the information flowing to enemies who believed they had insider advantage, about the way betrayal could be weaponized if you were willing to embrace the same ruthlessness that had created it. We use it, she said. We feed Aldrich the information we want Cordelia to have. We make her believe she knows our strategy. And then we do something completely different. Turn his betrayal into our weapon. Cadric pulled back, wiping his face with the back of his hand, the vulnerability disappearing beneath layers of tactical assessment. That requires letting him continue operating, requires me to look him in the eye every day and pretend I do not know he sold me for gold. Yes, it does. Can you do that? Cadric walked to the weapons rack and selected a dagger, tested its balance, his hand steady despite the tears still drying on his face. I can do anything, he said quietly, if it keeps you alive. Even this. Even pretending trust while planning how to destroy the person who taught me what trust meant. He looked at her, and Serafina saw the exact moment when something inside him shifted, when grief transformed into cold calculation, when the man she had married disappeared beneath the Duke who survived through absolute brutality. "Go to your chambers," he said. "Pack light. Essentials only. Because whether this strategy works or not, you are leaving tonight. I will not argue about it. I will not negotiate. You are the only thing I have protected that actually matters, and I will not watch you die because I was too sentimental to save you." Cedric. Jean. No. This is not a discussion. This is an order from your Duke, and you will obey it because the alternative is me locking you in the tower until you starve or someone rescues you, whichever comes first. Serafina saw it in his eyes. The absolute finality. The decision already made and calcified into something immovable. She had two choices: obey and live, refuse and watch him destroy himself trying to protect her. 48 hours, she said. Give me 48 hours. If the situation has not improved by then, I will leave. But I will not abandon you before we even know if the strategy works. Cedric looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to physically carry her to the passages and shove her through himself. But something in her expression stopped him. Maybe he saw the same ruthless determination he had spent weeks cultivating in her. Maybe he recognized that she had learned too well how to fight. Maybe he just understood that forcing her to leave would break something between them that even survival could not repair. 48 hours, he agreed finally. Then you go, with or without my permission. Agreed. They stood there in the war room, surrounded by maps of territories neither of them might live to govern, making promises about a future that depended entirely on whether betrayal could be transformed into salvation. Outside, the first arrows began hitting the castle walls. Cordelia Ashford had started her assault 3 hours early, and Serafina realized with terrible clarity that 48 hours might have been a grotesque overestimation of how much time they actually had left. Black shafts with iron tips designed to punch through armor and flesh alike, raining down on Ravenstone's battlements like a metal storm. Soldiers ducked behind stone merlons while others returned fire, their own arrows arcing into the darkness below where Cordelia Ashford's forces assembled in terrifying precision. Serafina crouched beside Cedric on the eastern wall, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body despite the winter cold. 3 hours early. Cordelia had attacked 3 hours before anyone expected, which meant someone had told her the fake sortie plan was bullshit and the real vulnerability was right now, right here, during the narrow window when Ravenstone's defenses were reconfiguring. Aldrich's betrayal had teeth. Below them, siege engines rolled forward through the snow, massive trebuchets capable of hurling stones heavy enough to crack castle walls. Battering rams reinforced with iron plating that would splinter the sabotaged eastern gate within minutes once they reached it. And behind the siege equipment, thousands of soldiers carrying Cordelia's banner, a silver serpent on crimson field, the symbol chosen specifically because serpents killed through venom instead of direct confrontation. Appropriate for a woman who had just poisoned 30 years of trust to buy herself a duchy. Cedric watched the assault formation with the detached assessment of a man evaluating his own execution. "She is committing everything to the first wave," he said, raising his voice over the sound of arrows striking stone. "No reserves, no staged assault. She believes the gate sabotage guarantees victory, so she is gambling her entire force on breakthrough before we can compensate." General Veld appeared beside them, blood streaking his armor from a grazing hit to his shoulder. "The gate mechanism is still jammed. Engineers estimate 15 minutes before we can seal it properly. If those rams reach us before then, we are looking at enemy forces in the courtyard. How many men can we deploy to hold the gate? 200, maybe 300 if we pull from the northern defenses, but that leaves Pemberton an opening." Cedric turned to look at the northern approach, where Lord Pemberton's forces waited in the darkness, not attacking yet, just watching to see where Ravenstone committed resources before making their own move. Strategic patience. The kind that won wars while others bled themselves dry on fortifications. "Pull them," Cedric ordered. "Strip the northern wall to skeleton crews, everyone else to the eastern gate. If Cordelia breaches, nothing else matters. We hold that choke point, or we die." Veld saluted and disappeared into the chaos. Serafina stayed crouched beside Kaedric, her hand wrapped around the dagger at her waist, knuckles white from pressure. "You should be in the tower," Kaedric said without looking at her. "I should be wherever you are. That was the agreement." "The agreement was 48 hours. It has been 40 minutes. Then I have 47 hours and 20 minutes left to be useful." A massive stone launched from one of Cordelia's trebuchets slammed into the wall 30 feet to their left. The impact shook the entire castle, stone dust exploding into the air, screams cutting through the darkness as soldiers caught in the blast zone went down. Kaedric grabbed Serafina and pulled her flat against the wall, his body covering hers, waiting for secondary collapse that would send them both plummeting 70 feet to the courtyard below. The wall held, barely. Cracks spiderwebbed across ancient stone, but the structure remained intact, testament to engineering from centuries past, when men built fortresses to withstand exactly this kind of punishment. "You cannot protect me and command a defense simultaneously," Serafina said against his chest, feeling his heart slamming erratic rhythms. "You need to choose." Kaedric pulled back just enough to look at her, and what she saw in his eyes was something beyond fear, beyond calculation. The raw terror of a man who had spent his entire life controlling variables and suddenly understood that. Control was an illusion people embraced to avoid acknowledging how fragile everything actually was. "I choose both," he said. "I hold this castle and keep you alive. Those are not contradictory objectives. They are when the castle is falling and keeping me alive requires you to abandon defensive coordination. Then I redefine success. Survival is not about holding territory. It is about making sure something worth protecting actually survives." Another trebuchet stone hit the wall. Closer this time. Close enough that Serafina felt the concussive force in her teeth. Kaedric stood and pulled her up with him, already moving toward the stairs that descended into the courtyard. "War room. Now. We coordinate from there where falling stones are less likely to turn us into decorative smears." They ran through corridors filled with soldiers moving equipment and wounded being carried toward makeshift medical stations. The castle had transformed into an organism preparing to die, every system stripping down to essential functions, everything else sacrificed in service of a few more hours of defiant existence. The war room was chaos given architectural form. Commanders shouted over each other. Messengers sprinted in and out carrying updates that were obsolete before they finished being delivered. Maps covered in hastily drawn troop positions that changed faster than anyone could track. And in the center of it all, Lord Aldrich Thorne stood calmly updating casualty projections like a man who had not sold them all for gold. Serafina felt rage crystallize in her chest, pure and cold and absolutely focused. This man had betrayed everyone in this room, had sabotaged their defenses, had ensured that soldiers currently dying on the walls were dying because he valued his own advancement over their lives. And he stood there wearing concern like a mask, playing the role of loyal advisor while counting minutes until his investment paid dividends. Kaedric's hand settled on her shoulder. A warning. Not yet. They needed Aldrich functional until the strategy played out. Needed him feeding Cordelia false confidence so the real trap could close. But Serafina understood something Kaedric did not want to acknowledge yet. The trap required them to survive long enough to spring it, and survival was becoming less probable with every stone that slammed into Ravenstone's walls. "Report," Kaedric demanded, and the room fell silent. Captain Greaves stepped forward, his uniform scorched from fire arrows. "Eastern gate holding, but barely. The mechanism jam means we cannot seal it, but the engineers rigged a temporary brace using broken wagon parts. It will not stop a sustained battering ram assault, but it buys us time. Casualties at 43 dead, 92 wounded. Cordelia's forces have moved siege equipment to within 200 yards. First ram impact expected in 10 minutes. Northern approach? Pemberton is still holding position. No movement. He is waiting to see if Cordelia's assault succeeds before committing resources." Kaedric turned to Aldrich. "Your assessment?" Aldrich looked thoughtful in the way that made Serafina want to drive her dagger through his throat. Cordelia is overcommitted. She gambled everything on the sabotage guaranteeing quick victory. If we hold the gate for another hour, her forces will be exhausted and vulnerable to counterattack. But that requires holding, which requires men we may not have. "We have men," The question is whether we have time. Aldrich nodded slowly, and Serafina saw calculation behind his eyes, saw him measuring how much longer to maintain the pretense before revealing his true allegiance. But Caedric had already moved past him, addressing Commander Cross. I need a cavalry strike. 50 riders, light armor, fast horses. You punch through Cordelia's siege line, target the trebuchets, cause enough chaos to disrupt their coordination. You will not come back. Understand? This is a suicide run designed to buy the gate defenders 15 minutes. Cross did not hesitate. Yes, Your Grace. I will lead it personally. No, you are too valuable. Send Captain Rourke. He is expendable. Cross's jaw tightened, but she nodded, because this was the calculus of war. Some people were resources to be spent. Some were infrastructure to be preserved. And the difference between the two determined who lived and who became statistics in ledgers no one would ever read. Serafina watched Caedric make decisions that would kill people, watched him assign soldiers to die buying time measured in minutes, watched him transform human beings into tactical instruments without hesitation or visible remorse, and understood that this was what ruling actually meant. Not the grand decisions about policy and governance, the small horrifying choices about whose death served the larger purpose. The ability to look someone in the eye and send them to die, knowing their sacrifice might not even matter. This was the lesson Caedric's father had tried to teach him through brutality. That power required the willingness to spend lives like currency. That sentiment was weakness. That caring about individual suffering made you unable to make the decisions that kept the larger structure functional. But Serafina saw something Caedric's father had never understood. Caedric did care. He just cared about something larger than individual survival. He cared about making sure the deaths meant something, about ensuring the sacrifice purchased actual victory instead of just delaying inevitable defeat. That distinction was everything. It was what separated him from becoming his father. The difference between brutality in service of ego and brutality in service of purpose. Moment. The cavalry strike launched 12 minutes later. Serafina watched from the battlements as 50 riders exploded from Ravenstone's western gate, horses screaming as they charged across open ground toward Cordelia's siege engines. Arrows fell on them like rain. Crossbow bolts punched through armor. Men tumbled from saddles, trampled by their own mounts, dying before they hit frozen earth. But enough made it through. Enough to reach the trebuchets and swing torches into the mechanisms. Enough to slash ropes and kill engineers, and create the exact chaos Caedric had ordered them to die creating. One trebuchet caught fire, flames climbing the wooden frame like a living thing. Another collapsed when supporting ropes were severed, the counterweight crashing down and crushing 3 soldiers who had been loading ammunition. The third managed one final shot before cavalry riders swarmed it, their sacrifice buying 15 minutes of reprieve. Exactly as calculated. Serafina felt sick watching it, felt the weight of those deaths settling into her bones like lead. 50 people had just died because Caedric ordered it, because tactical necessity required spending lives to buy time, because this was the reality of power stripped of comfortable illusions. You are thinking it was wasteful, Caedric said beside her. I am thinking it was necessary. There is a difference. Good. Because the moment you stop seeing the difference is the moment you become useless for anything except decoration. He turned to face her, and exhaustion had carved lines into his face that made him look decades older. I have sent 300 men to die tonight, some in direct combat, some holding positions everyone knows cannot be held, some buying minutes with their lives so others can survive seconds longer. And I will send 300 more if it means you walk out of here alive. That is what ruling means, Serafina. The willingness to make decisions that destroy you from the inside while keeping everyone else functional enough to survive. I know. Do you? Because you still look at me like I am redeemable, like underneath the brutality is someone worth saving. But I'm not sure that person exists anymore. I think maybe he died years ago, and what is left is just momentum wearing his face. Serafina grabbed his arm hard enough to hurt. You are not your father. Stop trying to convince yourself otherwise. Your father would have sent those riders to die for pride, for demonstration, for the theater of dominance. You sent them to die because it was the only play that gave us a chance. Intent matters, even when the outcome looks identical. Caedric started to respond but stopped as Captain Greaves appeared, sprinting up the stairs, his expression carrying the kind of urgency that preceded catastrophic updates. Your Grace, the northern wall. Pemberton is not waiting anymore. They ran, through corridors, up spiral stairs, across battlements where soldiers fired arrows into darkness below. The northern wall was chaos. Pemberton had committed his forces the moment Caedric stripped defenders to reinforce the eastern gate, and now thousands of soldiers were scaling walls using siege ladders, while archers provided covering fire. General Veld was already there, coordinating defense with the skeleton crew that remained. "We cannot hold both positions simultaneously," he shouted over the sound of combat. "We need to choose, eastern gate or northern wall. Commit resources to one and abandon the other." Caedric looked between the two fronts. East, where Cordelia hammered the sabotaged gate. North, where Pemberton's forces climbed walls largely undefended. Two simultaneous threats designed to split focus and guarantee at least one breakthrough. Classic pincer strategy, the kind that won wars. "How long can the eastern gate hold without reinforcement?" Caedric demanded. 20 minutes, maybe 30. Then the rams punch through and we are fighting in the courtyard. "And the northern wall? They are over it already. We are down to hand-to-hand combat, trying to push them back before they establish a foothold. 5 minutes, maybe less." Caedric stood absolutely still. Serafina watched him process variables, calculate outcomes, weigh the cost of each decision against the probability of success. Then she saw the exact moment when he understood the truth. There was no winning move, no tactical brilliance that salvaged this situation. He had been outmaneuvered by forces that understood his capabilities and deployed overwhelming numbers to negate skill with sheer mass. Sometimes there was no strategy clever enough to compensate for being outnumbered 3-1. "Evacuate the northern wall," Caedric ordered, his voice flat. "Pull everyone back to the inner courtyard. We establish a defensive perimeter around the keep and hold there. Abandon everything else." Veld looked shocked. "Your Grace, if we abandon the northern wall, Pemberton's forces have free access to half the castle." "I know. Do it anyway. We cannot defend what we do not have resources to hold. Consolidate. Make them fight for every corridor, every room. Turn the castle into a killing ground where numbers become a disadvantage." That is siege endgame strategy. We are talking hours before— "I know what we are talking about, General. I am giving you an order. Execute it, or I will find someone who will." Boom! Veld saluted and began shouting commands. Soldiers started retreating from the northern wall in controlled withdrawal, forming lines of defense that collapsed incrementally toward the castle's heart. Caedric turned to Serafina. "Now you go. Right now. There is a passage from my private chambers to the cliffs below. 6 guards are waiting with horses and supplies. You take that exit, and you ride until you reach the coast. No arguments, no delays. This is no longer a request. No." The single word hung between them like a blade. "Serafina, no. I am not leaving you to die defending walls you just admitted cannot be defended. If you are consolidating to the keep, then I consolidate with you. We made vows 4 hours ago. Till death. I meant it, even if you did not." Caedric's hand shot out and gripped her throat. Not choking, not violent. Just holding her there, with enough pressure to make breathing difficult. "You do not understand what you are choosing. What it means when they breach the keep. They will not just kill you, Serafina. They will make examples. Cordelia wants to demonstrate what happens to women who challenge the established order. She will ensure your death is public and prolonged and designed to terrify anyone else who might consider defiance." Serafina met his eyes without flinching. "Then she will discover that I learned from the best teacher available, that I know where to place a dagger to cause maximum damage, that I would rather die fighting beside you than live decades knowing I ran when it mattered most." "You stupid, stubborn, absolutely infuriating woman. Yes, you married me. That was your choice." Caedric pulled her close and kissed her. Not gentle, not romantic, desperate and furious, and tasting like blood from where she bit his lip. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "I do not know how to protect you from this," he said. "You do not. We protect each other, or we die trying. Those are the options." An explosion rocked the eastern wall. The gate had fallen. Serafina heard the sound of wood splintering and soldiers screaming and the roar of hundreds of voices as Cordelia's forces poured through the breach into Ravenstone's courtyard. Caedric released her and drew his sword. Inner keep. Now, we make our stand there. Okay. They ran through corridors filling with smoke. Behind them, the sounds of invasion echoed through ancient stone. Soldiers fighting, dying, buying seconds with their lives so others could retreat further into the castle's shrinking defensive perimeter. The inner keep was the castle's final fortress, walls within walls, a structure designed to be held by small numbers against larger forces. The last resort of rulers who understood that sometimes survival meant sacrificing everything except the single room where you made your final stand. Caedric sealed the keep doors himself, iron bars sliding into place, mechanisms locking with finality that sounded like prison gates closing. Inside the keep, 200 soldiers assembled, the last defenders. Everyone else was dead or dying, or had already surrendered hoping for mercy they would not receive. These were the ones who had chosen to die with their duke, rather than live as prisoners or turncoats. Caedric stood at the center of the hall, surrounded by men and women who had followed him through years of brutal governance. And for the first time since Seraphina had met him, he looked uncertain. "I have no speech to give you," he said. "No words that make this acceptable. You are here because I made decisions that led to this moment, because I executed magistrates who deserved execution but did it without royal permission. Because I married a woman the nobility hated and elevated her to a position that threatened their control. Because I ruled through fear long enough that when the fear stopped working, I had nothing else to offer." He paused, and Seraphina saw him struggling with something. "My father would tell you that dying for your duke is the highest honor, that sacrifice in service of power is noble, that your deaths will mean something because they protected the Ravenstone legacy." Caedric looked around the hall at faces that trusted him despite everything. "But my father was a liar who weaponized loyalty to avoid admitting his own failures. So I will tell you the truth instead. You are about to die for nothing, for a legacy built on brutality that the kingdom has decided to dismantle, for a duke who mistook fear for respect long enough that when he finally tried to be different, it was too late. You are dying because I was not good enough to find another way." The silence was absolute. Then Commander Cross stepped forward. "With respect, Your Grace, that is horseshit." Caedric blinked. "Excuse me? We are not here because you failed. We are here because every other noble in this kingdom is a coward who values comfort over justice. Because you were the only one willing to execute thieves regardless of their titles. Because you married a woman who exposed corruption instead of a woman who would stay decorative and silent. Because you are the only duke in the Northern Territories who treats soldiers like people instead of resources to be expended." She looked around at the other defenders. She looked around. "I have served in 12 campaigns under 6 different commanders, and Caedric Ravenstone is the only one who remembers the names of soldiers who die under his command, the only one who personally delivers death notifications to families, the only one who established pensions for wounded veterans instead of leaving them to beg. So yes, we are about to die, but we are dying for something that mattered, for someone who gave a damn when no one else did. And that is worth more than living under nobles who would rather let us starve than admit their own corruption." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the defenders. Caedric looked stunned, like someone had just spoken a language he had forgotten how to understand. "I do not know what to do with loyalty I have not earned," he said quietly. "Then learn," Cross replied, "because we are about to teach you what it looks like when people choose to die for you instead of being ordered to." Before Caedric could respond, something massive slammed into the keep doors. The battering ram. The final assault beginning. Caedric turned to Seraphina one last time. "Please go. There is still time. The passage is sealed behind me. I made sure of it before we entered the keep. So stop asking me to abandon you and start figuring out how we survive this." Another impact. The doors shuddered but held. Caedric looked at her and something in his expression shifted. Not resignation, not acceptance. Something harder, more dangerous. The look of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for impossible situations and suddenly remembered that impossible was just another variable to be manipulated. "You want to survive this?" he asked. "Yes." "Then we do something no one expects. We do not defend. We attack." The entire hall went silent. "Your Grace," Veld said carefully, We are barricaded in the keep with 200 soldiers against thousands outside. Attacking is suicide. Defending is also suicide. At least attacking chooses the terms of our death. Cedric walked to the map table and started moving pieces with the kind of speed that came from inspiration born of desperation. Cordelia's forces are massing outside these doors expecting prolonged siege. They are positioned for assault, not defense. Pemberton's troops are securing the northern sections, spread thin trying to hold territory. Neither force expects us to come out fighting. They expect us to barricade and wait for starvation or surrender. He looked up, and Serafina saw the strategist who had survived 6 years of border wars, calculating angles no one else could see. We open the doors. We charge directly into Cordelia's formation with everything we have. Maximum violence, maximum chaos. We cut straight through to where Cordelia herself commands from, and we kill her, publicly, brutally, in front of her entire army. Then we offer her soldiers a choice. Join us against Pemberton or die with their commander. The silence that followed was the sound of 200 people processing insanity. That is not a strategy, Aldrich said, finally speaking up. That is desperation wearing tactical language. Cedric smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Serafina had ever seen. You're right, Aldrich, it is desperation. But here's what you do not understand about desperation. It makes you dangerous in ways calculation never could. Because people who have nothing left to lose stop caring about survival long enough to do things survivors would never risk. He turned back to the assembled defenders. We are all dead. That is the baseline. Accept it. Embrace it. Let it make you vicious. And then we walk out of these doors and teach Cordelia Ashford exactly what happens when you corner predators instead of prey. Another impact. The door cracked, splinters flying. Minutes away from breach. Who's with me? Cedric demanded. Every single soldier in the hall raised their weapon, because when you had already accepted death, courage became the only currency that mattered. Cedric moved beside Serafina, pressing a second dagger into her hand. Stay close. Kill anyone who comes near you. And if I fall, you run. Straight through the chaos. Find a horse. Get to the coast. Promise me. I promise, Serafina lied again, because she understood now what Cedric had been trying to teach her all along. Survival was not about following rules. It was about understanding which rules could be broken and which breaking would get you killed. And right now, the only rule that mattered was this. When the world gave you impossible choices, you chose violence and hoped momentum carried you through to the other side. The keep doors shattered. Cordelia's forces poured through the opening, swords raised, screaming victory before they had earned it. And Duke Ravenstone charged directly into them with 200 soldiers and one duchess who had learned to kill, all of them choosing attack over surrender, chaos over calculation. One final desperate gamble against enemies who had never expected prey to fight like predators. The collision was apocalyptic. The collision was not warfare. It was butchery given momentum. 200 desperate souls crashed into Cordelia's forces with the kind of violence that came from people who had already accepted death and decided to make it expensive. Cedric led from the front, his sword moving in arcs that separated men from their lives with brutal efficiency. No elegance, no artistry, just the mechanical brutality of someone who understood that killing was a technical problem requiring technical solutions. Serafina stayed 3 steps behind him, both daggers drawn, her world narrowing to the space immediately around her body. A soldier lunged from her left and she moved the way Cedric had taught her, stepping into the attack instead of away, getting inside his reach where his sword became useless and her daggers became everything. She drove the blade up under his ribs, angled toward his heart, and felt the resistance as steel punched through muscle and organ. The man's eyes went wide with surprise and then empty, and Serafina was already moving toward the next threat before his body hit the ground. This was what survival actually looked like. Not noble, not heroic, just desperate people doing desperate things while screaming filled the air and blood turned stone floors slippery. Cordelia's forces had expected siege. They were positioned for prolonged assault, siege equipment deployed, supplies distributed for weeks of grinding attrition. They were not ready for 200 berserkers charging directly into their formation with nothing to lose and everything to gain from creating maximum chaos. The momentum carried Ravenstone's defenders 50 yards into enemy lines before the surprise wore off, and Cordelia's commanders started organizing coherent response. By then, it was too late. The damage was done. Cordelia's perfect assault formation had collapsed into confused brawling, where superior numbers became disadvantage instead of strength. Kaedric cut through soldiers like he was harvesting wheat, his face splattered with blood that was not his own, his eyes empty of everything except tactical calculation. Serafina watched him become the thing his father had tried to create through brutality, the perfect weapon wearing human skin, and understood with terrible clarity that this was the cost of power. Not the grand decisions about governance, the small moment-to-moment erosion of everything soft until all that remained was the willingness to keep swinging your sword long after normal people would have collapsed from exhaustion and horror. They reached the command position 15 minutes after the assault began. Cordelia Ashford stood surrounded by her personal guard, 20 elite soldiers whose only job was keeping their commander alive. She wore armor custom-fitted to her frame, crimson enamel over steel, a serpent engraved across the breastplate. Beautiful and deadly, and absolutely furious at watching her perfect strategy dissolve into chaos. Her eyes locked with Kaedric's across 20 feet of corpse-strewn courtyard. "You stupid, desperate fool!" she shouted over the sounds of combat. "You cannot win this. Even if you kill me, Pemberton's forces will crush you. The crown will send armies. You have already lost." "This is just theater." Kaedric stopped 10 feet from her guard formation, sword dripping, breathing hard but steady. "You are right," he said. "This is theater. But here is what you never understood about theater, Cordelia. The audience only remembers the final act. And the final act of your story is dying in a courtyard you thought you had already conquered." "Kill him," Cordelia ordered. Her guards moved forward in coordinated formation, professional soldiers who had trained together for years. But Kaedric had brought Commander Cross and General Veld, and the three of them hit that guard line with combined assault that turned professional competence into scattered desperation within seconds. Serafina watched Kaedric fight with the kind of terrible beauty that came from absolute mastery, every movement precise, every strike calculated for maximum efficiency. He did not waste motion, did not showboat, just dismantled threats with mechanical brutality until he stood facing Cordelia with nothing between them except corpses and the weight of decisions that had led to this moment. "Your father would be proud," Cordelia said, circling slowly, her own sword drawn now. "You became exactly what he tried to create, a monster who solves problems through violence." "My father," Kaedric said quietly, "died choking on his own blood because he believed fear made him invincible. I learned from his mistake. Fear is a tool, nothing more. And when tools stop working, you find different ones. And what tool are you using now? Desperation? Suicide masked as strategy? Love, bet." The word hung in the blood-soaked air like something alien. Cordelia laughed, genuine surprise cutting through her fury. "You are dying for love? The great Duke Ravenstone, butcher of the Northern Territories, reduced to romantic delusion?" Kaedric glanced back at Serafina, and what she saw in his eyes made her chest constrict. "Not dying for love," he said. "Killing for it. There's a difference. Dying is passive. Killing is choice. And I choose to remove every threat to the woman I married before I let exhaustion or superior numbers finish what you started." "Diamantici," he attacked. The duel lasted 90 seconds. Cordelia was good, better than good, trained by the best sword masters her late husband's fortune could purchase. But Kaedric had spent 6 years in border wars learning that dueling was performance art and killing was industrial efficiency. He did not try to outfence her. He just waited for the opening and took it, his blade punching through the gap between her breastplate and helmet, the strike precise enough to sever her spinal cord. Cordelia dropped like a puppet with cut strings, dead before she processed what had happened. Kaedric stood over her body, breathing hard, then raised his voice to carry across the courtyard. "Your commander is dead. You can die with her defending a cause that died 90 seconds ago, or you can live by accepting new terms. Lay down weapons, swear temporary truce. Help us eliminate Pemberton's forces who will slaughter you the moment they realize Cordelia cannot pay what she promised. Then we negotiate surrender terms that do not involve mass executions." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wounded men dying and fire crackling where siege equipment burned. Then one by one, Cordelia's soldiers began lowering their weapons. Not all of them. Some chose loyalty over survival, and Ravenstone's defenders cut them down without hesitation. But enough surrendered that the eastern courtyard transformed from active battlefield to tense armistice within minutes. Kedrick turned to face Pemberton's approaching forces, and Serafina saw exhaustion finally starting to show in the way he held his sword. "We are not done," he said quietly. "I know," Serafina replied, standing beside him, covered in blood and viscera, her daggers still ready. "But we are still alive. That counts for something. Does it? Or are we just prolonging the inevitable?" Before she could answer, Lord Aldrich Thorne appeared from the keep, moving fast, his expression carrying urgency that made Serafina's hand tighten on her dagger. "Your Grace," Aldrich said, slightly out of breath. "Messenger from the capital just arrived. The Crown Council has been dissolved. The princess has assumed regency pending formal coronation, and she is offering terms." Kedrick went absolutely still. "What terms?" "Full pardon for the magistrate executions in exchange for continued governance of the Northern Territories under Crown oversight. Formal recognition of your marriage, and a seat on the new Crown Council." That is convenient timing. The princess is 23 years old and surrounded by vultures who want to control her. She needs allies who actually know how to govern. You terrify her, but you're also the only duke who maintains functional order in your territories. She is choosing pragmatism over principle. Kedrick looked at Aldrich for a long moment. Kedrick. And Serafina saw him processing layers of implications. "You sent that message," Kedrick said quietly. "You contacted the princess directly, circumvented the Crown Council, made sure she knew exactly what was happening here and why." Aldrich met his eyes without flinching. "Yes." "Why?" "Because 30 years of service means I know the difference between necessary betrayal and pointless cruelty. I sold information to Cordelia. I sabotaged your defenses. I ensured she had every advantage. And I did it knowing you would discover the betrayal and use it against her. Because the only way to save you from yourself was to create a situation desperate enough that even you would be forced to ask for help instead of trying to solve everything through violence." The courtyard went silent. Kedrick's hand tightened on his sword until his knuckles went white. "You manipulated everything. The betrayal, the siege, all of it calculated to force me into accepting crown terms I would have rejected under normal circumstances." "Yes. Because you are too proud to admit when you need assistance. Too damaged by your father's lessons to understand that power shared is power multiplied. I had to break you down until survival became more important than pride. And it worked. You are still alive. Your wife is alive. Your territories remain functional. The cost was my betrayal and your trust, and I judged that cost acceptable." Serafina watched Kedrick process this, saw the fury and grief and terrible understanding warring across his face. "You are either the best advisor I have ever had," Kedrick said finally, "or the most dangerous enemy I will ever face. I genuinely cannot decide which." "Both," Aldrich said simply. "I have always been both. That is why your father kept me close despite hating everything I represented. Because good advisors tell you what you want to hear. Dangerous ones tell you what you need to know. And great ones betray you in ways that keep you alive long enough to learn the difference." Kedrick was silent for a long time, staring at the man who had just admitted to orchestrating the worst night of his life for the explicit purpose of saving him from himself. Then he started laughing, not humor, something darker. The sound of a man who had just discovered that even his betrayals had been managed by people who understood him better than he understood himself. "I should execute you," Kedrick said. "Yes, you should, but you will not, because you need me. And more importantly, because your wife is standing there looking at me like she already calculated every angle I just explained and is 3 steps ahead of both of us." Serafina had been watching Aldrich with the kind of assessment Kedrick had taught her, looking for tells, micro-expressions, anything that would indicate whether this explanation was truth or just another layer of manipulation. And what she saw was exhaustion, genuine bone-deep weariness from a man who had spent 30 years managing disasters and had just orchestrated the most elaborate one of his career. "He is telling the truth," she said, "or at least he believes he is telling the truth. The distinction probably does not matter at this point." Kedrick turned to her. "You trust him?" I trust that he kept you alive when killing you would have been easier and more profitable. I trust that his betrayal served a purpose beyond personal gain. Beyond that, no. I do not trust him, but I do not need to trust him to understand that we need him. Pemberton's forces had stopped advancing. They were close enough to see Cordelia's body, close enough to recognize that the situation had shifted in ways that made continuing the assault strategically questionable. Kedrick addressed Aldrich without looking at him. Send word to Pemberton. Cordelia is dead. The Crown has offered terms. He can accept truce and withdraw with honor intact, or he can continue the assault and face combined forces of Ravenstone and Cordelia's surrendered soldiers. His choice. But make it clear that stubbornness will be expensive. Aldrich nodded and disappeared to execute the command. Seraphina stood beside Kedrick in the blood-soaked courtyard, surrounded by corpses and wounded soldiers and the ruins of a siege that had almost destroyed everything, and felt the adrenaline finally starting to fade. Her hands shook. Her legs threatened to collapse. The reality of what she had just survived crashed over her like a wave of ice water. She had killed people, multiple people, had driven daggers into flesh and watched men die and kept moving because stopping meant dying herself. And now that the immediate threat had passed, the weight of those deaths settled into her bones like lead. Kedrick caught her as her knees buckled, lowering her carefully to sit on rubble that had been a wall 6 hours ago. Breathe, he said quietly. Just breathe. The shaking is normal. The nausea is normal. The feeling that reality is fragmenting is normal. You are not broken. You're just processing what it costs to survive. I killed people. Yes, you did. And that knowledge will live with you permanently. There's no making peace with it. No justification that makes it acceptable. You just carry it and hope the weight becomes bearable eventually. Does it become bearable? Bom Dolscheiss. Kedrick was silent for a long moment, staring at the carnage they had created. No, he said finally. It just becomes familiar. And familiar is close enough to bearable that you can function, most days. Seraphina leaned against him, feeling his heartbeat steady against her shoulder, and understood that this was the reality beneath the grand narratives about power and governance. Not the strategic decisions. The slow accumulation of violence until you became someone you would not have recognized 6 months ago. The erosion of innocence so gradual you did not notice until you were standing in a courtyard covered in other people's blood and realizing it did not bother you as much as it should. This was the cost Kedrick had been trying to protect her from. Not death, transformation. Becoming the kind of person who could kill efficiently and feel nothing except strategic relief that the threat had been eliminated. I do not want to be this person, she said quietly. I know, but you are this person now. The question is what you do with it, whether you let the violence define you, or whether you use it as foundation for building something better. What did you do? Worry? Kedrick looked down at her, and the expression on his face was something close to hope-wearing exhaustion as camouflage. I married someone who asked that question, and I am trying to figure out whether redemption is possible for people like me, or whether the best I can hope for is making sure the violence I am capable of serves purposes beyond my own survival. What? Pemberton accepted his truce 3 hours later, not because he trusted Kedrick, because continuing the assault meant fighting soldiers who had nothing left to lose, and those were the most dangerous kind. He withdrew his forces with minimal casualties and dignity intact, already calculating how to position himself with the new princess regent. By dawn, Ravenstone Castle looked like what it was, a fortress that had barely survived annihilation. Walls cracked, gates shattered, courtyards filled with bodies waiting for burial details. Smoke still rising from fires that had burned through the night. Kedrick stood on the western battlements watching the sun rise over territories he had governed through fear and brutality and the occasional glimpse of something approaching justice. Seraphina stood beside him, wrapped in a cloak someone had given her to replace her blood-soaked dress. The princess wants to meet you, Kedrick said. Personally. She is sending a delegation within the week to formalize terms and ensure I am actually governable instead of just temporarily cooperative. Are you governable? I have no idea. I have spent 34 years learning how to dominate. I have no training in collaboration, no experience with compromise. The entire framework of my existence is built on the assumption that I decide and others obey. Changing that requires becoming someone fundamentally different. Is that possible? Fundamental change? Kadric was quiet for a long time, watching light spread across the valley below. My father believed people were fixed. That character was carved in stone by childhood, and attempting to change it was weakness. He spent years trying to burn sentiment out of me because he thought ruthlessness was the only trait worth cultivating. And for a long time I believed him, believed I was the thing he created, that my capacity for violence defined everything I could become. He turned to look at Serafina. Then you walked into my throne room and looked at me like I was a problem you intended to solve. And suddenly I had to confront the possibility that maybe I was not fixed. Maybe the person I had become was not inevitable. Maybe I had choices beyond just being my father's weapon wearing a different face. Do you believe that now? That you have choices? I believe I have you. And you make different choices seem less impossible, which is probably the closest I will come to optimism. Serafina took his hand, feeling calluses from sword work and scars from old wounds. The crown wants oversight. That means magistrates watching everything you do, auditors reviewing your decisions, political rivals looking for mistakes they can exploit. You will hate it. I already hate it, but hating something has never stopped me from doing it when necessary. And keeping you alive is necessary. Keeping these territories functional is necessary. Learning how to govern without relying solely on fear is necessary. The fact that I hate the process is irrelevant. Very romantic. Kedrick almost smiled. Very romantic. Kedrick. I am not a romantic man, Serafina. I'm a practical one who has discovered that the most practical decision I can make is ensuring your survival. Everything else is just implementation details. Below them, the castle slowly came back to life. Servants clearing rubble, soldiers tending wounded, engineers assessing structural damage. The machinery of survival beginning to turn despite exhaustion and trauma. What happens now? Serafina asked. Now we rebuild. We bury our dead. We negotiate with a princess who is probably as terrified of me as I am of her. We figure out how to govern territories that have only known brutality and fear. We survive long enough to see whether survival was worth the cost. That is not a plan. That is just a list of problems. Yes, but they are problems we are alive to solve, which makes them better than the alternative. The burials took 3 days. Kadrick insisted on being present for every single one. 547 soldiers, 83 servants, 12 civilians caught in crossfire. Every person who had died defending Ravenstone or simply been unlucky enough to be present when violence erupted. He stood through every ceremony, refusing to sit, refusing to delegate, forcing himself to witness the cost of decisions he had made. Serafina watched him break slowly under the accumulated weight of those deaths, saw the way his shoulders bowed incrementally with each new grave, and understood that this was the price of conscience. His father would have delegated the burials, would have treated the dead as statistics in ledgers rather than people who deserved acknowledgement. But Kadrick made himself watch, made himself remember, made himself carry the weight because carrying it was the only thing that separated him from becoming the monster his father had tried to create. On the third day, they buried Commander Cross. She had survived the initial assault but died from wounds sustained during the fighting, her body finally giving out after holding on long enough to see Cordelia fall. Her soldiers built a cairn on the western cliffs overlooking the sea, a monument to someone who had chosen to die for a duke who remembered soldiers' names instead of living under nobles who treated them like expendable resources. Kedrick stood at that cairn longer than any of the others, staring at stones that marked the grave of someone who had believed in him when belief was irrational. I did not deserve her loyalty, he said quietly. Probably not, Serafina agreed, but she gave it anyway. And you honored it by making sure her death meant something. That counts. Does it? Or is that just a story I tell myself to make the weight bearable? Both. It is always both. The truth and the story we tell about the truth. You do not get to choose between them. You just carry both and hope the story makes the truth survivable. Kedrick looked at her, and something in his expression had changed. Not softness, but an acknowledgement that hardness alone was insufficient for the kind of governance he was being forced to learn. "I do not know how to do this," he said. "How to rule without fear as the primary tool. How to make decisions that balance justice with mercy. How to be the person you seem to think I am capable of becoming." Then we figure it out together, make mistakes, learn from them, build something better than what our fathers left us. That is a low bar. Good. Low bars are achievable. Aim higher later once we have established functional baseline. The princess arrived 2 weeks after the siege. Princess Alara Thorne, 23 years old, accompanied by a delegation of advisors who looked terrified of being within 50 miles of Duke Ravenstone. She wore traveling clothes instead of courtly gowns, practical boots instead of decorative slippers, and moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that appearing weak was invitation for exploitation. Serafina watched from a balcony as the royal delegation entered Ravenstone's rebuilt courtyard and felt something unexpected. Not fear, curiosity. Because this young woman had just inherited a kingdom tearing itself apart, and her first major decision had been offering alliance to the Duke, most likely to challenge her authority. Either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. The formal reception was tense. Nobles who had survived the siege watched the princess with mixed calculation and wariness. The princess watched Caedric like someone evaluating a dangerous animal from inside a cage, uncertain whether the bars would hold. Caedric knelt, which surprised everyone, including Serafina. The Duke of Ravenstone did not kneel, did not bow, did not acknowledge authority beyond his own except when absolutely forced. But he knelt in front of a 23-year-old princess and lowered his head in gesture of submission that looked physically painful. "Your Highness," he said, "Ravenstone acknowledges your regency and accepts terms as offered. The Northern Territories remain loyal to the crown." Alara looked down at him, and Serafina saw calculation behind young eyes. "Rise, Duke Ravenstone. Loyalty through coercion serves no one. I would prefer loyalty through mutual benefit if such a thing is possible between us." Caedric stood slowly. "Mutual benefit requires trust. I am not certain I have earned that from you." "You have not, but you have demonstrated competence, which is rarer than trust and more useful in crisis. I need governors who can maintain order. You need legitimacy that does not come from fear alone. Those needs can serve each other if we are both willing to compromise. I am not skilled at compromise." "Then learn." "I am not skilled. I'm not skilled at governance, but I am learning quickly because the alternative is watching my kingdom burn. We adapt or we die. Those are the options." The princess was smarter than Caedric had anticipated. Serafina saw him recalibrating assessment in real time, recognizing that this was not a naive girl playing at power, but someone who understood exactly how precarious her position was and had decided pragmatism over pride. "What do you need from Ravenstone?" Caedric asked. "Order, stability, proof that the Northern Territories can be governed through something other than brutality. An honest assessment when my advisors are lying to me, which is approximately 80% of the time." "That is a substantial request." "You executed magistrates for stealing from starving provinces. You married a woman the nobility despised because she exposed corruption. You survived a siege by charging into superior forces with nothing except desperation and competence. You are many things, Duke Ravenstone, but you are not a liar. And I desperately need people around me who value truth over political convenience." Caedric looked at Serafina, and she saw the question in his eyes. This was the moment. The choice between maintaining independence and accepting integration into a larger structure that would constrain his authority. Serafina nodded once. Permission, encouragement, acknowledgement that survival sometimes required surrendering control to achieve stability. "Ravenstone will provide honest assessment," Caedric said, "and maintain order in the Northern Territories. In exchange, I need autonomy and governance methods and protection from nobles who will attempt to undermine me through political maneuvering. Agreed, with one condition. Which is, your wife joins the Crown Council. As your representative and as independent voice, I need perspective from someone who understands what governance costs people outside the nobility. And she has demonstrated both competence and willingness to challenge authority when necessary." Every person in the hall went absolutely silent. Serafina felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward her. The girl from a ruined house. The woman who had exposed corruption and survived assassination attempts and learned to kill. Now being offered a seat on the Crown Council where decisions that shaped the entire kingdom were made. She looked at Kaedric. He smiled, and it was genuine. Not calculation, not strategy, just honest pride. "The princess makes an excellent point," he said. "You are far better at navigating court politics than I am, and significantly less likely to execute people who annoy you." "That is an extremely low bar," Serafina replied. "Nevertheless," she turned to face Princess Alara directly. "I accept, with the understanding that I represent Ravenstone's interests but not exclusively, that my loyalty is to governance that serves people instead of just maintaining noble privilege." "I would expect nothing less," Alara said. "Welcome to the council, Duchess Ravenstone. I suspect you will hate it approximately as much as I do. That is comforting in a deeply pessimistic way." The princess laughed, and suddenly she looked her age instead of decades older. "We are going to get along excellently," she said. Okay. 6 months later, Serafina stood in the same throne room where she had first met Kaedric and marveled at how much had changed while the architecture remained identical. The throne room was no longer a cathedral of intimidation. The weapons still lined the walls, but now they shared space with tapestries depicting northern landscapes. The banners from conquered provinces had been replaced with emblems representing the villages and towns that comprised Ravenstone's territories. The floor was still polished black marble, but now it reflected light from windows that had been unsealed to let in sunshine. Small changes, incremental adjustments, but they transformed the atmosphere from oppressive to merely formal. Kaedric entered from his private chambers, no longer wearing black exclusively. Today he wore charcoal with subtle gray threading, a concession to Serafina's argument that looking slightly less like death itself might improve diplomatic relations. "The village magistrates are here," he said, "ready to argue about tax distributions and infrastructure investment. This is going to be exhausting. Yes, welcome to governance that requires listening to people instead of just ordering them around. I hate it. I know. You tell me approximately 6 times per day, and yet you continue making me do it. No. Because you are better at it than you think, and because the villages need infrastructure more than they need you brooding on battlements pretending to be your father." Kaedric walked to where she stood near the window and pulled her close, his chin resting on top of her head. "I do not know who I am without the brutality," he said quietly. "My entire identity was built on being harder and meaner than anything the world could deploy against me. And now I am attending village council meetings and negotiating tax structures and trying to figure out how to govern through something other than fear. It feels like performing a role I was never trained for." "You are not performing. You are learning. There is a difference." "Is there? Because most days I feel like an actor playing at being human, while the real me waits underneath, ready to emerge the moment I let my guard down." Serafina turned in his arms to face him directly. "The real you is the person who attended every single burial, who remembers soldiers' names, who established pensions for wounded veterans, who married me when it was strategically questionable, who charged into impossible odds to protect people he claimed not to care about. That person is not performance. That person is who you become when you stop trying to be your father." "What if I cannot sustain it? What if the moment something goes wrong, I revert to violence because it is the only language I actually speak fluently? Then I will be here to remind you that violence is a tool, not an identity, that you have other options, that becoming your father is choice, not inevitability, and that I did not survive assassination attempts and a siege to watch you destroy yourself through fear of your own capacity for change." Kaedric held her tighter, and Serafina felt him shaking slightly. "I love you," he said. "I am not sure I know how to love correctly, but I am certain I love you. And it terrifies me more than any enemy I have ever faced." "Good. Fear means you care about the outcome, and caring is the foundation everything else is built on." Someone knocked on the door. The village magistrates waiting for an audience with the Duke, who had transformed from tyrant to something approaching functional governor over the course of 6 brutal months. Kaedric took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and became the person he was learning to be. Not the monster his father created, not the weapon deployed against enemies, just a man trying to govern territories through competence instead of fear, while figuring out whether redemption was possible for people who had spent decades believing violence was the only answer. Ready? Serafina asked. No. But I've learned that being ready is overrated. Sometimes you just start and hope momentum carries you towards something resembling success. They walked into the throne room together, Duke and Duchess, partners instead of possessions, two people who had survived everything the world deployed against them and decided that survival was just the baseline for building something better. The magistrates bowed as Caedric approached, not from fear, from respect earned through months of listening instead of ordering, through infrastructure investment instead of intimidation, through demonstrated commitment to governance that actually served people. Caedric gestured for them to rise and began the tedious work of negotiating tax structures and agricultural subsidies and water rights disputes. The kind of governance that required patience instead of swords, compromise instead of domination, the willingness to be wrong and adjust rather than simply imposing authority through force. Serafina watched him work and understood that this was what power actually looked like when stripped of comfortable illusions. Not the grand gestures, not the dramatic confrontations, just the slow accumulation of small decisions that gradually transformed how people lived. The recognition that governance was not about controlling people, but about creating systems that allowed them to survive and occasionally thrive. This was the lesson neither of their fathers had understood. That real power was not the capacity to destroy, but the willingness to build. That strength was not domination, but resilience. That the hardest thing a ruler could do was admit when violence was insufficient and other tools were required. And watching Caedric negotiate with farmers about irrigation schedules while maintaining his dignity, Serafina felt something she had not expected to feel 6 months ago. Hope. Not naive optimism, not blind faith in inevitable progress, just the realistic assessment that people capable of surviving apocalyptic violence were also capable of building something better from the ruins. That transformation was possible even for people who had spent decades believing they were fixed. That love was not weakness, but foundation strong enough to support reconstruction's Chabak. That evening, Serafina found Caedric on the western battlements where he often went when the weight of governance became temporarily unbearable. The sun was setting over territories he had ruled through fear and was learning to govern through something approaching wisdom. The magistrates seemed satisfied, she said, standing beside him. They were negotiating in good faith. That still surprises me. I keep expecting them to be afraid to agree with everything I say because disagreeing is dangerous, but they actually argue. Actual substantive disagreement about resource allocation and infrastructure priorities. It is unsettling. It means they trust you enough to be honest. That is progress. Is it? Or is it just proof that I have become too soft to maintain actual authority? Serafina took his hand. You killed Cordelia Ashford in single combat. You survived a siege through tactical brilliance and desperate violence. You charged into superior forces with nothing except blades and determination. You are many things, Caedric, but soft is not among them. You are just learning that authority maintained through fear alone is fragile, and authority earned through competence is sustainable. I miss the simplicity of fear. It was reliable, predictable. Fear never negotiated about irrigation schedules or questioned infrastructure budgets. Fear also eventually triggers rebellion. You governed through fear for years, and it ended with multiple noble houses attacking simultaneously and the crown declaring you traitor. Fear worked until it did not, and then it nearly destroyed everything. This is harder, but it does not have that failure mode. Caedric was quiet for a long time, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. My father would hate what I have become, he said finally. Good. Your father was a monster who weaponized his own son. His hatred is confirmation you are moving in the right direction. You see, what if I am not moving in any direction? What if I am just treading water while pretending transformation, waiting for the moment when everything collapses and I revert to violence because it is the only thing I actually understand? Serafina turned to face him directly, taking both his hands. Then we face that moment when it comes. We acknowledge the violence without letting it define you. We use it as tool when necessary and put it away when other tools are more appropriate. You do not have to be perfectly transformed, Caedric. You just have to be willing to keep trying, to keep choosing something other than your father's path, even when that path looks easier. Why do you stay? You could leave. Could take your council position and return to the capital where court life does not involve regular siege defense and political assassination. Why stay in Ravenstone with someone who might never be fully redeemed? Serafina smiled. Because I do not need you fully redeemed. I need you trying. I need the person who attends every burial and remembers soldiers' names and negotiates in good faith with farmers about water rights. I need the man who charged into impossible odds to protect me. I need you exactly as you are. Violence and vulnerability and determination to be something other than the weapon your father created. She leaned up and kissed him, feeling him relax incrementally against her. Besides, she said, I am not exactly innocent anymore. I killed people during the siege. I have blood on my hands and nightmares that wake me 3 times per week. We are both damaged, Kedrick. But we are damaged together, which means we understand each other in ways undamaged people never could. And that understanding is foundation enough for whatever we are building here. They stood together on the battlements while the sun set and the northern territories settled into evening routines. Villages lighting fires, farmers finishing work, families gathering for meals, the ordinary rhythms of life that continued regardless of who governed or how they governed, or whether that governance was brutal or compassionate. And Kedrick understood something his father had never grasped. That power was not the ability to control those rhythms. It was the responsibility to protect them, to create conditions where ordinary life could continue, to be strong enough that people did not have to be, to carry the weight so others could live without constant fear. That was what ruling actually meant. Not domination, service, the willingness to make yourself into a shield between your people and everything that wanted to destroy them. And if that shield was built from violence and scar tissue and trauma transformed into competence, then so be it. Shields were not meant to be beautiful, just functional. I do not know if I can be what the kingdom needs, Kedrick said quietly. The kingdom does not need perfect. It needs functional. And you are extremely functional at protecting people when you stop trying to intimidate them into submission. So be functional. Be the strategist who survived 6 years of border wars. Be the governor who remembers names. Be the husband who charged into impossible odds. Be all of those things and stop worrying about whether they add up to something your father would recognize. What do they add up to? Serafina thought about the question carefully before answering. Someone worth believing in, not because you are perfect, but because you are honestly trying to be better than what you were raised to become. And that effort, that willingness to transform despite how much easier it would be to just embrace your father's brutality, that is what makes you worth following, worth trusting, worth loving. Kedrick pulled her close, and they stood together watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. 2 people who had survived hell and decided that survival was just the beginning, that the real work was figuring out how to live with what survival had cost them, how to build something worth protecting from the ruins of everything that had almost destroyed them. Far below, the castle bells rang evening prayers. The sound echoed across the valley, and Kedrick realized he no longer heard them as warnings or threats or symbols of oppressive authority. Just bells, marking time, calling people together. A sound that could mean different things depending on who listened and what they chose to hear. And maybe that was the real lesson he had been learning these past 6 months. That meaning was not fixed. That the same tool could serve different purposes depending on how it was wielded. That he could be brutal and compassionate, violent and protective. His father's weapon and Serafina's partner, all simultaneously, because humans were complex enough to contain contradictions without breaking. Ready to go inside? Serafina asked. The council reports need reviewing before tomorrow's meeting. Council reports. The most exciting evening entertainment imaginable. You chose this life. You chose this life for me. I just agreed because arguing with you is exhausting. Liar. You agreed because you knew I was right. Also that. They walked together from the battlements into the warm interior of Ravenstone Castle, and the fortress that had once been a monument to fear and brutality had slowly transformed into something approaching a home. Not perfect, not without shadows, but functional. Livable. A place where 2 damaged people could build something worth protecting. And that, Kedrick was learning, was enough. Not the grand redemption arc, Not the complete transformation from monster to saint. Just incremental improvement. Small choices accumulating into something resembling wisdom. The willingness to try being better, even when better was exhausting and uncertain and required constant effort. He had spent 34 years becoming his father's weapon. Maybe he could spend the next 34 becoming something else. Something Serafina had seen potential for long before he believed transformation was possible. Someone worth the loyalty Commander Cross had given him. Someone worthy of the Faith Village magistrates showed by disagreeing honestly instead of agreeing from fear. Someone capable of governance that served people instead of just maintaining power through intimidation. Someone worth loving. And if he failed occasionally, if violence erupted despite his best efforts, if the brutality his father had burned into him surfaced in moments of crisis, then Serafina would be there to remind him that failure was not permanent, that trying and failing was still better than not trying at all, that the person he was becoming was not defined by his worst moments, but by his willingness to keep choosing better ones. The future was uncertain. The crown's oversight was restrictive. The nobility still schemed. Enemies still plotted. But for the first time in his life, Kedrick faced that uncertainty with something other than fear and violence. He faced it with partnership, with someone who knew exactly what he was capable of and loved him anyway, who had seen his absolute worst and decided transformation was possible, who believed in him with the kind of faith that made belief seem rational instead of naive. And maybe that was what love actually was. Not blind acceptance, not ignorance of flaws, just the willingness to see someone complete, violence and vulnerability together, and decide that the whole person was worth fighting for, even when fighting was hard. Serafina had fought for him when he could not fight for himself, had exposed corruption when he was too proud to admit it existed, had stood beside him when fleeing would have been safer and smarter, had killed to protect him and survived assassination to stay with him, and forced him to acknowledge that being loved was not weakness, but foundation strong enough to support reconstruction. She was the best strategic decision he had ever made, and the most terrifying, because losing her would destroy him more completely than any siege ever could. But that fear was acceptable, necessary, even, because fear meant caring about outcomes, and caring was the foundation everything else was built on. They had survived the siege, survived betrayal, survived the crown's judgment and the nobility's hatred and their own worst impulses. And if they could survive all that, then maybe they could survive the slower violence of trying to govern with wisdom instead of fear. The grinding attrition of daily choices that accumulated into patterns that defined who they became. Maybe redemption was not a destination, just a direction. And as long as they kept moving towards something better than what their fathers had been, the journey was its own reward. The northern territories stretched before them, full of people who needed protection and governance, and someone strong enough to shield them from chaos. And Duke Ravenstone, once the most feared duke in the kingdom, had finally learned that strength was not just the capacity to destroy. It was the willingness to build.